Welcome, dear travelers of the night, to Mystic Bedtime Stories, where ancient wisdom meets peaceful slumber. I'm your gentle guide through the corridors of time, and tonight we embark on a journey that will carry you across 23 centuries, to the banks of the sacred Ganges River, where one of history's most remarkable transformations took place. Here at Mystic Bedtime Stories, we believe that the most profound truths often whisper to us in our quietest moments. Each week, we explore the lives of extraordinary souls who shaped our world, not through the clash of swords or the roar of conquest, but through the gentle power of wisdom, compassion, and inner transformation. Tonight's story is perhaps the most beautiful example of such change. Allow yourself to settle comfortably wherever you are. Perhaps you're in your favorite chair by a window where moonlight filters through, or nestled beneath soft blankets that have welcomed you home after a long day. Take a deep breath and let the tensions of today drift away like morning mist over a still lake dot as we begin. Imagine yourself standing on the banks of the Ganges River at dawn. The air carries the scent of jasmine and sandalwood, mixing with the earthy fragrance of the great river that has witnessed countless centuries flow past like its own eternal waters. In the distance, you can hear the faint sound of temple bells, their bronze voices carrying across the vast plains of ancient India. This is the land where our story unfolds, in the time when mighty empires rose and fell like the monsoon seasons. It was an age when Alexander the Great's shadow had only recently withdrawn from these shores, leaving behind a vacuum that would birth the greatest empire the Indian subcontinent had ever known. Yet tonight, we don't speak of conquest in the traditional sense. Instead, we follow the extraordinary path of a young prince who would discover that the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but within the human heart. The years approximately 304 BCE, though time moved differently then, measured not by the relentless ticking of clocks, but by the slower rhythm of seasons, the rise and fall of rivers, and the patient turning of the cosmic wheel. In the magnificent city of Pataliputra, where the Ganges and Sun rivers meet in eternal embrace, a dynasty was taking root that would grow to encompass nearly all of the Indian subcontinent. This is the story of the Maurya Empire, but more intimately, it is the story of Ashoka, a name that still echoes through the corridors of history like a prayer whispered in an empty temple. When we speak his name today, we speak of a man who began his reign as a conqueror and ended it as one of humanity's greatest teachers of peace. But every great transformation begins with a single step, and Ashoka's journey toward enlightenment began in the rich soil of ambition, strategy, and the complex political landscape of ancient India. To understand the man who would become known as Ashoka the Great, we must first understand the empire that shaped him and the remarkable individuals who built the foundation upon which he would construct his legacy of peace. As we prepare to enter this ancient world, let your breathing slow and deepen. Feel yourself becoming lighter, as if you could float like a leaf on the gentle current of the Ganges, carried by the flow of time itself. The modern world, with its urgencies and demands, grows distant, fading like the last stars at dawn. In its place, the timeless rhythm of ancient India begins to emerge. You can hear the distant sound of elephants, their great feet padding softly along dusty roads. You can sense the presence of ox-drawn carts, loaded with spices, silk, and precious stones making their way along the Grand Trunk Road, that great artery that connected the far reaches of the known world. In the air, there's the sound of different languages, the mingling of cultures that made these ancient cities crucibles of human civilization. Tonight, we will walk with kings and sages, witness the birth of an empire, and most remarkably, observe one of history's most profound personal transformations. We will see how a young man drunk on power and conquest discovered that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to heal, to build, and to spread light in the darkness of human suffering. The story we're about to unfold together spans nearly a century, from the founding of the Mauryan Empire to its eventual decline. But at its heart, it is the story of approximately 40 years in the life of one extraordinary human being who chose to turn away from the path of violence and walk instead toward the light of compassion. As we begin this journey, remember that you are not merely a listener, but a fellow traveler. You walk beside Ashoka as he faces the great moral crisis of his life. You stand with him as he witnesses the terrible cost of his own ambition. And you share in the profound peace that comes when he finally understands that the greatest empire is not built of stone and steel, but of kindness, wisdom, and the gentle cultivation of the human spirit. So close your eyes now, dear friend, and let the gentle current of this ancient story carry you away from the shores of the present moment. Feel yourself drifting backward through time, past the noise and hurry of our modern age, past the industrial revolutions and Renaissance periods, past the rise and fall of countless civilizations, until you arrive at that magical moment when the future of much of Asia would be determined not by the strength of armies, but by the awakening of one man's conscience. The journey begins now, in the soft light of dawn over the Ganges, where the whispers of Ashoka still echo across the centuries, carrying messages of peace, wisdom, and the eternal possibility of transformation that lives within every human heart. In the year 326 BCE, when the world was young and empires were carved from dreams and determination, a momentous event occurred along the banks of the Hydaspes River. Alexander the Great, the Macedonian conqueror who had swept across the known world like a force of nature, stood face to face with the fierce resistance of King Porus and the indomitable spirit of India itself. But even as Alexander's armies achieved their Pyrrhic victory, something profound was shifting in the cosmic balance of power. The great conqueror, exhausted by years of campaigning and sensing the limits of his mortal ambition, began his long retreat westward. Behind him, in the fertile valleys and bustling cities of the Indian subcontinent, a power vacuum emerged that would soon be filled by a force more enduring than any foreign conquest. Picture, if you will, the ancient city of Taxila, where the great universities attracted scholars from across the known world. The air hummed with intellectual discourse, the sound of scholarly debate mixing with the gentle ring of temple bells. It was here, in this crucible of learning and political thought, that a young man named Chandragupta Maurya walked the stone pathways between lecture halls, his mind absorbing not only the wisdom of ancient texts, but also the practical lessons of statecraft and military strategy. Chandragupta was not born to greatness in the traditional sense. He was not the son of a great king or the heir to vast territories. Instead, he was something perhaps more powerful, a young man with an acute understanding of opportunity and the rare ability to see beyond the immediate horizon to the greater possibilities that lay hidden in the chaos of his time. As Alexander's governors, known as the Diadochi, struggled to maintain control over their distant eastern territories, Chandragupta observed their weaknesses with the patient eye of a natural strategist. He saw how these foreign rulers, magnificent as they might be in their homeland, were like magnificent trees transplanted to alien soil, their roots never quite taking hold in the rich earth of India. In the northwestern regions, where Alexander's influence had been strongest, local populations chafed under foreign rule. The Macedonian satraps, for all their military prowess, lacked the deep cultural understanding necessary to govern peoples whose traditions stretched back millennia. They ruled through force rather than through the more subtle art of winning hearts and minds. It was into this landscape of opportunity that Chandragupta stepped, but he did not step alone. Fate had provided him with a guide whose intellect would prove to be the perfect complement to his own ambition. This was Kautilya, known also as Chanakya, a man whose name would become synonymous with political wisdom and strategic brilliance. Kautilya was a Brahmin, a member of the priestly class, but his interests extended far beyond the sacred rituals and religious ceremonies of his birth. He was a political theorist, an economist, and perhaps most importantly, a master of what we might today call realpolitik, the art of governing through practical rather than moral considerations. Together, these two men, the ambitious young warrior and the brilliant strategist, began to weave a plan that would fundamentally alter the course of Indian history. They understood that the moment was ripe for a truly Indian empire, one that would not merely replace foreign rule with local rule, but would create something entirely new, a political structure that could unify the vast diversity of the subcontinent. Under a single effective administration, the plan began to unfold with the precision of a well-composed symphony. Chandragupta, guided by Kautilya's strategic insights, began to forge alliances with local rulers who shared his vision of independence from foreign domination. He understood that military might alone would not be sufficient to create a lasting empire. What was needed was a combination of strategic thinking, diplomatic skill, and the ability to inspire others to share in a greater vision. The first phase of their campaign focused on the northwestern territories, where Alexander's successors were most vulnerable. One by one, the Macedonian strongholds fell, not always through direct military confrontation, but often through the more subtle arts of negotiation, bribery, and the careful cultivation of local support. As news of these victories spread, something remarkable began to happen. Local rulers and tribal chiefs, who had long chafed under foreign rule, began to see in Chandragupta not just another conqueror, but a liberator who promised to restore Indian rule to Indian lands. The young leader's reputation grew, and with it his ability to attract both warriors and wise counselors to his cause. By 321 BCE, Chandragupta had established control over much of the northwestern regions. But this was only the beginning. His ultimate prize lay far to the east, in the rich kingdom of Magadha, with its capital at Pataliputra, the great city that controlled the trade routes of the Ganges Valley. Magadha was ruled by the Nanda dynasty, a family that had grown wealthy through trade and taxation, but had gradually lost the loyalty of their subjects through excessive greed and oppressive policies. The Nandas possessed great wealth and maintained large armies, but they lacked the one thing that Chandragupta had in abundance: the support of the people. The campaign against the Nandas was unlike the quick strikes that had characterized Chandragupta's earlier victories. This was a patient, methodical process that required not just military skill, but also the ability to win over the hearts and minds of the Magadhan people. Kautilya's influence was crucial here, as he understood that lasting political change required more than military conquest. It required the creation of a new social contract between ruler and ruled. As Chandragupta's forces moved eastward, they were not merely conquering territory. They were offering an alternative vision of governance. Instead of the extractive policies of the Nandas, who seemed to view their subjects primarily as sources of revenue, Chandragupta promised efficient administration, fair taxation, and protection from both foreign invaders and domestic criminals. The final confrontation with the Nanda forces was less a battle than a political revolution. Faced with an enemy who commanded popular support and promised better governance, many of the Nanda soldiers simply laid down their arms and joined the Mauryan cause. The last Nanda king, Dhanananda, found himself isolated and abandoned, his vast wealth useless in the face of Chandragupta's political momentum. In 321 BCE, Chandragupta Maurya entered Pataliputra, not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The great city, with its magnificent palaces and bustling markets, became the capital of what would grow to become the largest empire in Indian history. But more than its size, what made the Mauryan Empire remarkable was its organization, its administrative efficiency, and its ability to unite diverse peoples under a single effective government. The empire that Chandragupta built was not a loose confederation of allied kingdoms, but a centralized state with a sophisticated bureaucracy, a professional army, and a systematic approach to governance that would serve as a model for future Indian rulers. Roads were built to connect distant provinces. A postal system carried messages across vast distances, and a network of spies and informants ensured that the central government remained informed about conditions throughout the empire. But perhaps, most importantly, the Mauryan Empire represented something new in the ancient world. The idea that an empire could be built not just through conquest, but through the promise of better governance and the delivery of genuine benefits to its subjects. This was a lesson that would prove crucial for Chandragupta's grandson, the young prince who would one day be known as Ashoka the Great Dot. As we watch the sun set over the newly established Mauryan Empire, we can sense the enormous potential contained within this political creation. Like a seed that contains within itself the blueprint for a mighty tree, the empire that Chandragupta built contained the possibilities for both great achievement and profound transformation. The stage was now set for the drama that would unfold over the next century, a drama that would culminate in one of history's most remarkable personal and political transformations. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the palace of Pataliputra lay shrouded in gentle darkness, a solitary figure could often be found in the royal library, hunched over palm leaf manuscripts by the flickering light of an oil lamp. This was Kautilya, the architect of the Mauryan Empire, working on what would become one of the most influential political treatises in human history, the Arthashastra. As this monumental work would come to be known, was far more than a simple manual of statecraft. It was a comprehensive guide to the art of governance, a philosophical exploration of power and its proper use, and a practical handbook for rulers who sought to create not just successful empires, but enduring civilizations. Imagine, if you will, the mind that could conceive such a work. Kautilya possessed the rare combination of theoretical brilliance and practical experience that allowed him to see governance not as a collection of separate skills, but as a unified art form. Like a master painter who understands how each brushstroke contributes to the overall composition, Kautilya understood how every aspect of statecraft, from taxation to military strategy, from diplomacy to espionage, worked together to create the complex symphony of effective rule. The Arthashastra begins with a fundamental premise that would have seemed revolutionary to many of Kautilya's contemporaries: the idea that the purpose of government is not merely to maintain the ruler's power, but to create conditions under which society as a whole can flourish. This was not altruism in the modern sense, but rather a sophisticated understanding that the long-term stability of any government depends ultimately on the welfare of its subjects. Not in the gentle light of those early morning hours, Kautilya would carefully inscribe his observations about the nature of power and its proper exercise. He understood that raw force alone could never create lasting stability. Instead, he advocated for what we might today call the carrot and stick approach, a careful balance of incentives and punishments that would guide behavior without creating the resentment that inevitably accompanies purely coercive rule. The economic sections of the Arthashastra reveal Kautilya's deep understanding of the interconnected nature of political and economic power. He recognized that a thriving economy was essential for political stability, and that political stability was necessary for economic growth. His prescriptions for taxation, trade regulation, and resource management were designed not to extract maximum revenue in the short term, but to create sustainable prosperity that would benefit both ruler and ruled. But perhaps most fascinating of all were Kautilya's insights into human psychology and the dynamics of political loyalty. He understood that people's allegiance to their government was not a simple matter of fear or tradition, but rather a complex calculation involving their perception of the government's competence, fairness, and commitment to their welfare. This psychological sophistication would prove crucial in the administration of an empire as vast and diverse as the Mauryan state. The treatise devoted considerable attention to the art of espionage and intelligence gathering. Kautilya recognized that effective governance required accurate information about conditions throughout the empire, and he developed an elaborate system of spies and informants who would report directly to the central government. But this was not mere paranoia. It was a sophisticated understanding that problems could be addressed more effectively if they were identified early, before they had the chance to grow into serious threats to stability. In matters of military strategy, Kautilya's approach was characteristically nuanced. While he certainly understood the importance of military strength, he consistently emphasized that the best victories were those achieved without fighting. Diplomacy, economic pressure, and psychological warfare were all preferable to direct military confrontation, not only because they were less costly in terms of resources and lives, but because they created less resentment and were, therefore, more likely to produce lasting results. The Arthashastra also contains detailed discussions of legal principles and judicial procedures. Kautilya understood that the rule of law was essential for both economic development and political stability. His legal framework was designed to be both predictable and fair, creating an environment in which people could make long-term plans and investments with confidence that their rights would be protected. But perhaps most remarkably, the Arthashastra grapples with questions of political ethics that remain relevant today. How should a ruler balance the competing demands of different groups within society? When is it justifiable to use deception or force in pursuit of political goals? How can a government maintain legitimacy while making difficult decisions that may be unpopular in the short term? Kautilya's answers to these questions reveal a mind that was both pragmatic and principled. He understood that politics was often a realm of difficult choices between competing goods, and that the art of governance lay in finding solutions that served the broader public interest while maintaining the stability and effectiveness of the political system itself. As Chandragupta's reign progressed, the principles outlined in the Arthashastra were put into practice throughout the Mauryan Empire. The result was a level of administrative efficiency and political stability that impressed even foreign observers. Greek ambassadors who visited the Mauryan court wrote admiringly of the empire's road systems, its postal service, and its sophisticated approaches to taxation and trade regulation. The influence of Kautilya's thinking extended far beyond the immediate concerns of day-to-day governance. The Arthashastra established principles that would influence Indian political thought for centuries to come. The idea that government should be both effective and ethical, that rulers had obligations to their subjects as well as rights over them, and that political stability depended ultimately on the welfare of the people, became foundational concepts in Indian political philosophy. But perhaps most importantly for our story, the Arthashastra established the institutional framework that would make possible the remarkable transformation that would occur during the reign of Ashoka. The administrative systems, the network of communications, the established principles of governance that Kautilya had created provided the foundation upon which Ashoka would build his empire of peace and moral instruction. As we watch the aged Kautilya in those quiet pre-dawn hours, carefully polishing each phrase of his great work, we can sense that he understood the historical significance of what he was creating. This was not merely a manual for his own time, but a gift to future generations of rulers who would face the eternal challenge of wielding power wisely and well. The Arthashastra would outlive both its author and the empire for which it was written. Centuries later, when the Mauryan Empire had passed into history, scholars would still turn to Kautilya's insights for guidance in the complex art of governance. The work would be translated into numerous languages, studied in universities, and consulted by rulers throughout Asia and beyond. Out in the gentle morning light filtering through the palace windows, Kautilya would set down his stylus and survey his completed work with the satisfaction of a craftsman who has created something of enduring value. He had given the world not just a manual of statecraft, but a sophisticated exploration of the relationship between power and responsibility, between individual ambition and collective welfare, between the demands of the present and the obligations to the future. The stage was now set for the next act in our drama. The empire had been created, its principles established, its institutions functioning smoothly. Soon, a new generation would inherit this magnificent political creation, and among them would be a young prince whose name would echo through the centuries as a symbol of the transformation that is possible when power is guided by wisdom and tempered by compassion. In the year 298 BCE, as the monsoon rains swept across the Indian subcontinent, bringing life to the parched earth and renewal to the great rivers, a solemn ceremony took place in the magnificent palace of Pataliputra. Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of the empire, lay on his deathbed, surrounded by his family and closest advisors. The great conqueror who had united much of India under a single banner was preparing to pass his earthly throne to his son, Binjusara. The transition of power in ancient empires was always a moment of profound uncertainty. Would the heir possess the wisdom and strength necessary to maintain what his father had built? Would the delicate balance of forces that held the empire together survive the change in leadership? These questions hung in the air like incense smoke as the torch of Mauryan rule passed from father to son. Binjusara, whose name means drop of nectar in Sanskrit, was in many ways the perfect heir for such a moment. Unlike his father, who had been a revolutionary figure forced to create new institutions and establish new precedents, Binjusara inherited a functioning empire with established systems of governance. His challenge was not to create something new, but to maintain and strengthen what already existed. Picture, if you will, the young emperor in those first days of his reign. Binjusara possessed a temperament that was markedly different from his father's. Where Chandragupta had been bold and innovative, constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible, Binjusara was more cautious and deliberate. He understood that his role was not to revolutionize the empire, but to perfect it. This difference in temperament might have been seen as a weakness by some, but it proved to be exactly what the empire needed at this particular moment in its history. The institutions that Chandragupta and Kautilya had created were still relatively new and untested. What they needed was not further innovation, but the patient work of administration and refinement that would allow them to mature into truly effective instruments of governance. Binjusara approached his responsibilities with the methodical precision of a skilled craftsman. He understood that the empire was like a vast and complex machine, with thousands of moving parts that needed to work together harmoniously. His genius lay not in dramatic gestures or bold new initiatives, but in the quiet attention to detail that ensured every component of the imperial system functioned at peak efficiency. Under his careful stewardship, the Mauryan Empire expanded, its borders to encompass virtually the entire Indian subcontinent. But these conquests were achieved not through the dramatic military campaigns that had characterized his father's reign, but through patient diplomacy, strategic alliances, and the gradual integration of neighboring kingdoms into the Mauryan system. The southern regions of India, which had remained largely independent during Chandragupta's reign, were slowly brought into the imperial fold. Binjusara's approach to this expansion was characteristically subtle. Rather than launching costly military campaigns, he preferred to demonstrate the benefits of Mauryan rule through trade relationships, cultural exchanges, and the gradual extension of imperial infrastructure into new territories. Roads were built, connecting the southern kingdoms to the great trade routes of the empire. Mauryan merchants, protected by imperial guarantees and supported by standardized weights and measures, brought prosperity to regions that had previously been isolated from the great currents of commerce. Local rulers found themselves drawn into the orbit of Mauryan power not through conquest, but through the irresistible attraction of economic opportunity. The empire's administrative system also matured significantly during Binjusara's reign. The network of provincial governors, district administrators, and local officials that had been established during his father's time was refined and expanded. A sophisticated system of communication allowed the central government to maintain effective control over territories that stretched from the Hindu Kush Mountains in the northwest to the tropical forests of the south. But perhaps most importantly, Binjusara understood that the empire's greatest strength lay not in its military might or its economic resources, but in its ability to provide effective governance to its diverse population. He invested heavily in the institutions of justice, ensuring that the legal system established by Kautilya was implemented fairly and consistently throughout the empire. The reign of Binjusara was marked by a remarkable period of peace and prosperity. Trade flourished along the great highways that connected the empire to the wider world. Cities grew and prospered as craftsmen, merchants, and scholars were drawn to the opportunities offered by Mauryan rule. The empire's reputation for good governance spread far beyond its borders, attracting visitors and immigrants from across the known world. Foreign ambassadors who visited the Mauryan court during this period wrote admiringly of the empire's wealth and sophistication. The Greek ambassador Megasthenes, who spent several years in Pataliputra, left detailed accounts of the empire's administrative system, its military organization, and its cultural achievements. His writings provide us with invaluable insights into the daily life of the empire during its golden age. Yet for all his achievements, Binjusara remains something of an enigma to historians. Unlike his father, who left behind dramatic stories of conquest and revolution, or his son, who would become famous for his moral transformation, Binjusara's legacy is one of quiet competence and steady progress. He was, in many ways, the perfect middle ruler, the essential bridge between the empire's founding and its moral awakening. This quiet effectiveness was perhaps Binjusara's greatest gift to history. By maintaining and strengthening the foundations that his father had laid, he created the conditions that would make possible the remarkable transformation that would occur during the reign of his son. The empire that Binjusara passed on to the next generation was not merely larger and more prosperous than the one he had inherited. It was also more stable, more sophisticated, and more capable of adapting to new challenges. As Binjusara's reign drew to a close, the empire stood at the pinnacle of its power and influence. The great trade routes hummed with activity. The administrative system functioned with clockwork precision, and the borders were secure. But perhaps most importantly, the empire had developed something that would prove crucial in the years to come: a sense of shared identity and common purpose that transcended the boundaries of region, language, and culture. The young princes who would soon compete for the throne. Succession had been raised in this environment of prosperity and stability. They had learned statecraft not in the harsh school of survival that had shaped their grandfather, but in the more refined atmosphere of an established empire. Among these princes was one whose name would become synonymous with moral leadership and spiritual transformation. Ashoka. As we watch the aging emperor in the final years of his reign, we can sense the weight of expectation that surrounded the question of succession. The empire had grown beyond anything that its founders had imagined possible. It had become not just a political entity, but a civilization in its own right, with its own traditions, its own way of understanding the world, and its own vision of what human society could become. The stage was set for the next great chapter in the Mauryan story. The empire was strong, its institutions were mature, and its people were prosperous. What remained to be seen was whether the next generation of leaders would simply maintain what had been built, or whether they would find new ways to fulfill the empire's vast potential for human flourishing dot in the quiet gardens of the palace, where the aging emperor spent his final days. The scent of jasmine and the sound of temple bells created an atmosphere of peaceful contemplation. Here, in these moments of tranquility, the future of much of Asia hung in the balance, waiting for the young prince who would soon inherit not just an empire, but the awesome responsibility of guiding it toward its ultimate destiny. In the year 273 BCE, as the first light of dawn painted the marble terraces of Pataliputra in shades of gold and rose, a young prince stood on the palace balcony overlooking the vast expanse of his father's empire. His name was Ashoka, and at 25 years of age, he possessed all the qualities that the ancient world valued in a ruler: intelligence, physical strength, strategic acumen, and an unshakable confidence in his own destiny. The prince who would one day be known as Ashoka the Great was, in these early years, very much a product of his time and his upbringing. He had been raised in the lap of luxury, surrounded by the finest tutors, the most skilled warriors, and the most sophisticated courtiers that the Mauryan Empire could provide. From his earliest childhood, he had been groomed for power, taught to see himself as the inheritor of a great legacy and the guardian of an empire that stretched from the mountains of Afghanistan to the forests of southern India. Picture, if you will, the young Ashoka in those formative years. He was tall and powerfully built, with the bearing of a natural leader and the quick intelligence that marked him as his grandfather's true heir. His education had been comprehensive, covering not only the martial arts and military strategy that were expected of a prince, but also literature, philosophy, mathematics, and the complex art of statecraft that Kautilya had codified in his great treatise. But perhaps most importantly, Ashoka had been raised with an unquestioning belief in the righteousness of imperial expansion. The Mauryan Empire, he had been taught, represented the highest form of civilization that humanity had yet achieved. Its laws were just, its administration efficient, and its military invincible. To extend the boundaries of such an empire was not merely a political ambition, but a moral duty to bring the benefits of Mauryan rule to peoples who still lived in the darkness of disunity and ineffective governance. This confidence in the moral superiority of his empire was reinforced by everything that Ashoka observed around him. The great capital city of Pataliputra was a marvel of urban planning, with its wide boulevards, its sophisticated drainage systems, and its magnificent public buildings. The palace complex itself was a testament to Mauryan wealth and power, with its towering walls, its elaborate gardens, and its throne room that could accommodate thousands of courtiers and foreign dignitaries. The young prince spent his days in intensive preparation for the responsibilities that would one day be his. In the morning, he would train with the royal guard, learning the arts of swordsmanship, archery, and mounted combat. His instructors were the finest warriors in the empire, men who had served under his father and grandfather and who understood that the prince's education must be both thorough and practical. In the afternoons, Ashoka would study statecraft with the court's most senior advisors. He learned the intricacies of taxation and trade regulation, the principles of military organization, and the subtle arts of diplomacy and negotiation. These lessons were not merely theoretical. The prince was expected to understand how each aspect of governance contributed to the overall strength and stability of the empire. But it was in the evenings, as the sun set over the great river and the palace settled into its nighttime routines, that Ashoka's true character began to emerge. While his brothers and cousins often spent these hours in entertainment and leisure, Ashoka could be found in the palace library, poring over military histories and studying the campaigns of great conquerors from the past. He was particularly fascinated by the career of his grandfather, Chandragupta, whose transformation from a minor prince to the founder of an empire seemed to offer a template for his own ambitions. But Ashoka's reading extended far beyond the boundaries of the Mauryan Empire. He studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great, learning how the Macedonian conqueror had swept across the known world in a few short years. He read accounts of the Persian Empire at its height, when the authority of the great king had stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus River Delta. These studies convinced Ashoka that the Mauryan Empire, impressive as it was, had not yet reached its full potential. There were still independent kingdoms to the south that had never accepted Mauryan suzerainty. There were tribal peoples in the forests and mountains who lived according to their own customs and recognized no higher authority. Most significantly, there was the kingdom of Kalinga on the eastern coast, which had successfully resisted every attempt at conquest and stood as a constant reminder of the limits of Mauryan power. As Ashoka contemplated these challenges, he began to develop his own vision of what the empire could become. He imagined a time when the entire Indian subcontinent would be united under Mauryan rule, when the benefits of imperial administration would reach every village and hamlet, when the roads and trade routes would connect every corner of the known world. This was not merely a dream of personal aggrandizement, but a genuine belief that imperial unification would bring peace, prosperity, and order to millions of people. The young prince's confidence in his destiny was reinforced by the reactions of those around him. Court astrologers proclaimed that the stars favored his future reign. Military commanders spoke admiringly of his strategic insights and his natural leadership abilities. Even foreign ambassadors seemed to recognize something special in the young prince, treating him with a deference that went beyond mere protocol. But perhaps the most significant influence on Ashoka's early development was his relationship with his father, Binjusara. The emperor had multiple sons, and the question of succession was always a delicate matter in royal families. Binjusara, however, seemed to recognize in Ashoka the qualities that would be needed to lead the empire into its next phase of expansion and development. The emperor began to entrust his son with increasingly important responsibilities. Ashoka was appointed as governor of Ujjain, one of the empire's most important provincial centers. This posting was more than just a training exercise. It was a test of the young prince's ability to govern effectively and to maintain the loyalty of subjects who were far from the imperial capital. Ashoka's performance in Ujjain exceeded all expectations. He proved to be an effective administrator, maintaining order and prosperity in his province, while also demonstrating the kind of decisive leadership that would be essential in a future emperor. When rebellions broke out in other parts of the empire, it was Ashoka who was called upon to restore order, and he did so with a combination of military skill and political acumen that impressed even his father's most experienced advisors. But these successes only reinforced Ashoka's belief in the righteousness of imperial expansion. Each victory seemed to validate his conviction that the Mauryan Empire represented the highest form of human organization, and that its expansion was both inevitable and desirable. He began to speak openly of his plans for future conquests, identifying specific targets and developing detailed strategies for their subjugation. The young prince's confidence was infectious. Court officials began to speak of the coming age of Ashoka as a time when the empire would reach its ultimate boundaries and achieve its final form. Military commanders eagerly anticipated the campaigns that would extend Mauryan power into the last remaining pockets of independence. The very air of the palace seemed to vibrate with anticipation of the great conquests that were to come. As Ashoka stood on his balcony in those final years of his father's reign, surveying the vast expanse of territory that would soon be his to rule, he felt the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders. He was young, he was powerful, and he was absolutely certain of his ability to complete the great work that his grandfather had begun. The empire that he would inherit was already the largest and most powerful in Indian history. But Ashoka was determined to make it even greater, not the prince who gazed out over the Ganges River in those quiet moments before dawn had no way of knowing that his greatest victory would come not through conquest, but through surrender. He could not imagine that his most enduring legacy would be built not on the battlefield, but in the quiet chambers of his own heart, where the seeds of transformation were already beginning to take root, waiting for the right moment to bloom into something more beautiful and more powerful than any empire that had ever existed. The morning mist clung to the dire river like a silk veil, gentle and pure, as it had done for countless centuries before this fateful day. The year was 261 BCE, and the eastern coast of India lay bathed in the golden light of dawn. Along the riverbanks, where egrets once picked delicately through the shallows and fishermen cast their nets in peaceful rhythm, something far different was about to unfold. Emperor Ashoka stood upon a hill overlooking the vast expanse of Kalinga territory, his dark eyes surveying the land that stretched before him like an unfinished tapestry. The wind carried the scent of frangipani and salt air from the distant Bay of Bengal, but also something else, the metallic tang of anticipation that precedes great violence. Kalinga was unlike any territory the Mauryan Empire had encountered. This ancient kingdom stretched from the Baitarani River in the north to the Godavari in the south, encompassing what we now know as Orissa and parts of Andhra Pradesh. It was a realm of fierce independence, where the very air seemed to whisper of freedom. The Kalingas were not merely subjects to be conquered. They were a proud people who had never bowed to foreign rule, their spirits as untamed as the monsoon winds that swept across their coastal plains. For 8 years, Ashoka had ruled the Mauryan Empire with the confidence of youth and the certainty of absolute power. He had crushed rebellions with swift brutality, expanded borders with calculated precision, and maintained order through the sharp edge of imperial law. Yet Kalinga remained beyond his grasp of jewel that glittered tantalizingly on the eastern horizon, refusing to be plucked. The young emperor had reasons beyond mere territorial expansion for this campaign. Kalinga controlled vital trade routes along the eastern coast, and its strategic position made it the key to further expansion into the southern peninsula. But perhaps more than economics or strategy, it was a matter of imperial pride. How could the greatest empire India had ever known tolerate an independent kingdom within its natural borders? As Ashoka's massive army assembled on the plains, the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of history in the making. Elephants trumpeted in the pre-dawn darkness, their tusks gleaming like ivory crescents in the torchlight. Horses stamped and snorted, their breath forming clouds in the cool morning air. The sound of metal on metal rang out as soldiers checked their weapons, one final time swords that had tasted blood in a dozen campaigns, spears that had never failed to find their mark, shields that bore the scars of countless battles. The Mauryan army was a sight to behold, a living testament to the empire's might. Row upon row of infantry stretched to the horizon, their bronze armor catching the first rays of sunlight. Cavalry units moved with practiced precision, their riders sitting tall and proud in their saddles. War elephants, those giants of the ancient battlefield, stood like moving fortresses, their howdahs equipped with archers and spearmen, ready to rain death from above not but across the field. The Kalingas were no less prepared for what was to come. They had spent months fortifying their positions, turning every hill and grove into a potential stronghold. Their warriors, lean and weather-beaten from years of coastal living, moved with the fluid grace of those who had learned to fight, not just for conquest, but for survival. They knew every stone, every tree, every curve of the river that wound through their homeland. This was not just a battle for them, it was a defense of everything they held sacred. The Kalinga king had issued a declaration that would echo through the ages. We are the children of the sea and the storm. We will not bend the knee to any earthly power. His words carried the weight of generations, spoken by a people who had watched the tides come and go for centuries, who had weathered invasions and emerged stronger, who understood that some things were worth dying for God as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the battlefield. Both armies took their positions. The silence was profound, the kind of stillness that comes before thunder, when even the birds cease their singing, and the wind holds its breath. In that moment, thousands of men stood poised between life and death, between glory and oblivion, between the world as it was and the world as it would become. Ashoka raised his sword, and the blade caught the morning light like a captured flame. Behind him, war drums began their ominous rhythm, a heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with the pulse of the earth itself. The emperor's voice rang out across the field, carried by the wind to every corner of his vast army. For the glory of Maurya, for the unity of Bharata. The response was deafening, a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. Spears thrust skyward, creating a forest of metal points that gleamed like stars. Elephants trumpeted their battle cries, and horses reared in excitement. The moment of no return had arrived, but as the first wave of Mauryan soldiers surged forward, something unexpected happened. The Kalingas did not retreat. They did not flee before the overwhelming might of the imperial army. Instead, they stood their ground with a courage that bordered on the supernatural. Their own battle cry rose to meet the Mauryan roar. Kalinga! Kalinga, free as the wind, fierce as the storm. The collision, when it came, was like the meeting of two great waves. The crash of bronze on bronze, the screams of men and beasts, the whistle of arrows through the air, all merged into a symphony of violence that had no equal in the annals of ancient warfare. The battle was unlike anything that had come before, with casualties mounting at an unprecedented rate. Hour after hour, the fighting continued with an intensity that seemed to defy human endurance. The Kalingas fought with the desperation of those who knew they were making their last stand, while the Mauryans pressed forward with the relentless determination of those who had never known defeat. Elephants clashed like moving mountains. There, tusks locked in mortal combat, while their riders fought with sword and spear high above the chaos. The Daya River, which had flowed peacefully through the valley for millennia, began to change color. At first, it was just a faint tinge of red near the banks where the wounded came to drink. But as the day wore on and the casualties mounted, the river ran red with the blood of the fallen, carrying the crimson stain of war toward the distant sea. From his vantage point on the hill, Ashoka watched the battle unfold with growing unease. This was not the swift, decisive victory he had envisioned. The Kalingas were exacting a terrible price for every yard of ground gained. Their resistance was not just military, it was spiritual, born of a love for their homeland that transcended mere strategy or tactics. As the sun reached its zenith, the heat became almost unbearable. Warriors fought in a haze of dust and sweat, their movements growing slower as exhaustion took its toll. The air itself seemed to shimmer with violence, thick with the cries of the wounded and the smell of blood and death. Vultures began to circle overhead, their dark wings a grim promise of what was to come. Yet still the Kalingas held. Every hill they lost, they contested with such ferocity that the Mauryans began to question whether victory was worth such a cost. For the first time in his reign, Ashoka found himself contemplating the possibility of retreat, but imperial pride and the momentum of war carried him forward, deeper into a conflict that was consuming everything in its path. The breakthrough, when it finally came, was not the result of superior strategy or overwhelming force. It was exhaustion pure, simple exhaustion that finally broke the spirit of the Kalinga resistance. By the end of the day, 100,000 had been killed, 150,000 taken prisoner, and countless more had perished in the aftermath. As evening fell and the fighting finally ceased, an eerie quiet settled over the battlefield. The silence was more profound than any sound, a stillness that seemed to press against the eardrums like a physical weight. The Daya River continued its crimson flow toward the sea, carrying with it the dreams and hopes of a people who had chosen death over surrender. Emperor Ashoka descended from his hill and walked among the fallen. The ground was carpeted with bodies, Mauryan and Kalinga alike, their blood mingling in the dust until it was impossible to tell victor from vanquished. Elephants lay motionless beside their riders, their great hearts stilled forever. Horses whinnied softly in the gathering dusk, calling for masters who would never answer. But it was the faces of the dead that haunted Ashoka most. These were not the expressions of warriors fallen in glorious battle. These were the faces of men who had died in agony, in terror, in the certain knowledge that something precious was ending forever. Young faces and old, noble and common, all united in the democracy of death. As he walked deeper into the field of carnage, Ashoka came upon a sight that would remain etched in his memory for the rest of his days. A Kalinga warrior, little more than a boy, lay clutching a small wooden carving, perhaps a gift from a sweetheart, or a memento of home. The carving was of a lotus flower, its petals worn smooth by countless touches. In death, the young warrior's face held an expression of such peace that it seemed to mock the violence that had claimed him. The emperor knelt beside the body, his royal robes trailing in the bloody mud. For the first time in his life, the weight of absolute power felt not like a crown, but like a crushing burden. He had won his greatest victory, expanded his empire to its furthest extent, and proven the might of Mauryan arms beyond all doubt. Yet in that moment of triumph, something fundamental had shifted within him. The night that followed was unlike any other in Ashoka's life. Unable to sleep, he walked the battlefield under the stars, accompanied only by the soft sounds of suffering, the moans of the wounded, the distant crying of widows, the whispered prayers of those who tended the dying. The moon, full and silver, cast an ethereal light over the scene, transforming the carnage into something almost beautiful in its terrible finality. It was during these dark hours that Ashoka began to understand the true cost of conquest. Each body represented not just a soldier, but a son, a husband, a father. Each death sent ripples of grief through families and communities that would take generations to heal. The empire he had built was not just a political entity. It was a vast network of human connections, and he had severed thousands of those connections with a single day's violence. As dawn broke over the battlefield, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to echo the colors of the blood-soaked earth, Emperor Ashoka made a decision that would change not just his own life, but the course of human history. Standing among the fallen, with the rising sun illuminating the full extent of the carnage, he spoke words that would echo through the ages. Never again. Never again will I seek victory through violence. Never again will I mistake conquest for greatness. The Battle of Kalinga was over. The Mauryan Empire had achieved its greatest territorial expansion. But in winning everything, Ashoka had discovered that he had lost something far more precious, his own humanity. A young emperor who had entered the campaign drunk on power, and ambition would emerge from it as a different man entirely, one who would dedicate the rest of his life to healing the wounds that war had opened. As he turned away from the battlefield and began the long journey back to his capital, Ashoka carried with him not just the satisfaction of victory, but the terrible knowledge of what victory truly cost. The lotus carving he had taken from the dead Kalinga warrior lay heavy in his palm, a reminder of the beauty that violence destroys, and the peace that only comes when the sword is finally set aside. The transformation had begun. The conqueror was about to become something the world had never seen, an emperor who ruled not through fear, but through love. But that story would have to wait for another day, another dawn, another chance for redemption in a world that had seen too much of death and too little of mercy. The echoes of Kalinga would follow Ashoka for the rest of his days, a constant reminder that true greatness lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to know when to stay the hand and the courage to choose compassion over conquest. In the silence that followed the storm, a new kind of empire was about to be born, one built not on the foundations of fear, but on the bedrock of understanding, tolerance, and the recognition that all beings, in their deepest essence, seek nothing more than to be free from suffering. And so, as the sun set on the bloodiest day in ancient Indian history, it also began to rise on something unprecedented, the dawn of Dharma, the birth of an empire ruled not by the sword, but by the heart. The palace at Pataliputra had never seemed so vast nor so empty. In the weeks following the Battle of Kalinga, Emperor Ashoka found himself wandering through marble corridors that stretched like endless rivers of stone, his footsteps echoing in chambers that had once rang with the confident voices of conquest. The very walls seemed to whisper of the carnage he had witnessed, and sleep had become a stranger to him. But it was during one of these restless nights, as the moon cast silver patterns through the palace windows, that Ashoka encountered a figure who would change the course of his life forever. The man was seated quietly in the palace gardens, cross-legged beneath a Bodhi tree, his saffron robes barely visible in the darkness. He was neither young nor old, but possessed that timeless quality of one who had found peace with existence itself. This was Tissa, a Buddhist monk whose reputation for wisdom had begun to spread throughout the empire. Born in Pataliputra and living in the 3rd century BCE, he was destined to become associated with the Third Buddhist Council and the missionary activities that would spread Buddhism across Asia. But on this night, he was simply a man sitting in meditation, radiating a kind of calm that Ashoka had forgotten existed. "Your Majesty," the monk said without opening his eyes, his voice carrying the gentle authority of one who had wrestled with suffering and emerged victorious. "The heart that has seen too much violence seeks healing. Will you sit with me?" Ashoka, who had grown accustomed to the elaborate protocols of court life, found himself sinking to the ground beside this humble teacher. The earth felt solid beneath him, more real than the marble floors of his palace. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient dance, indifferent to the struggles of emperors and subjects alike. "I have conquered an empire," Ashoka said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yet I feel more defeated than the enemies I have vanquished." Tissa opened his eyes slowly, and in them Ashoka saw not judgment, but understanding. "Tell me, Your Majesty, what victory have you truly won if it has cost you your peace?" The question hung in the air like incense, penetrating deeper than any blade ever could. For the first time since Kalinga, Ashoka felt the tight knot of anguish in his chest begin to loosen. Here was someone who understood that true conquest was not of territories, but of the restless mind itself. "I have been reading the teachings of the Buddha," Ashoka confessed, surprising himself with the admission. "The words speak of suffering, of its causes, and of a path beyond it. But I am a king, a warrior. How can one who has caused so much pain follow a path of peace?" The monk's smile was gentle, like the first light of dawn. "The Buddha taught that all beings suffer, Your Majesty. Kings and peasants, warriors and merchants, all experience the pain of existence. But he also taught that suffering is not our permanent condition. It is possible to transform even the deepest anguish into compassion." Over the following nights, Ashoka found himself drawn back to these midnight conversations. Tissa spoke of the 4 noble truths that the Buddha had discovered beneath the Bodhi tree centuries earlier. Life contains suffering. This was undeniable. This suffering arises from attachment, from our desperate clinging to things that are temporary by nature. But there was hope suffering could end, and there was a path to that ending, a way of living that honored both wisdom and compassion. But how does one rule an empire through compassion? Ashoka asked during one of their sessions. My grandfather, Chandragupta, built this realm through strength. My father Binjusara maintained it through discipline. How can I govern through love? Moggaliputta introduced him to the concept of conquest by dharma, victory through principles of right, living rather than through violence. True power, the monk explained, comes not from the ability to force others to obey, but from the ability to inspire them to choose righteousness of their own accord. This was a revolutionary concept for a ruler raised in the traditions of realpolitik. Yet as Ashoka contemplated the endless cycle of rebellion and suppression that characterized most empires, he began to see the wisdom in this approach. Force bred resentment, and resentment bred resistance. But genuine respect, earned through just governance, could create a stability that armies alone could never achieve. The transformation was not immediate. For months, Ashoka struggled with the implications of his new understanding. He would issue orders in the morning, driven by Buddhist principles, only to countermand them in the afternoon, when practical considerations seemed to demand traditional responses. His advisors watched with growing concern as their emperor appeared to war with himself. Gradually, Ashoka began to develop what he called his policy of Dhamma, philosophy that emphasized social responsibility and tolerance among different members of society. This was not merely Buddhism transplanted into governance, but a unique synthesis of Buddhist ethics with the practical needs of ruling a vast, diverse empire. The word Dhamma itself was beautifully chosen. In Sanskrit, it carried meanings of duty, righteousness, and natural law. It suggested not arbitrary rules imposed by authority, but principles that emerged from the very nature of existence itself. Under Ashoka's interpretation, Dhamma became a bridge between the spiritual and the political, between the monastery and the marketplace. Through his edicts, Ashoka began to teach that everyone should serve their parents, revere teachers, and practice ahimsa, non-violence, and truthfulness. These were not complex theological doctrines, but simple, practical guidelines that any person, regardless of their religious background, could understand and follow. The emperor's personal practice deepened alongside his public policies. He established regular periods of meditation, often joined by Moggaliputta and other Buddhist teachers. The palace that had once echoed with the clatter of armor and the harsh voices of military planning now resonated with the gentle chanting of sutras and the soft discussions of ethical governance. Ashoka's family and court witnessed remarkable changes in the man who had once been known for his quick temper and ruthless decisions. Where he had previously settled disputes through intimidation or force, he now listened patiently to all sides, seeking solutions that honored the dignity of everyone involved. His judgments became famous for their fairness, and petitioners began to travel great distances simply for the opportunity to present their cases before an emperor who truly seemed to care about justice. The transformation extended beyond personal conduct to imperial policy. Ashoka asked everyone to avoid animal slaughter and sacrifice, not through harsh punishments, but through patient education about the interconnectedness of all life. He established hospitals not just for humans, but for animals as well, recognizing that suffering was suffering regardless of its form. Trade policies were revised to ensure fair treatment of merchants and laborers. Infrastructure projects were undertaken not merely for military advantage, but to improve the lives of common people. Roads were built with rest houses and medical facilities. Wells were dug in areas where water was scarce. Gardens were planted to provide shade and beauty for travelers. Perhaps most remarkably, Ashoka began to treat his subjects as his children. He regarded all his subjects as his children, and believed it the king's duty to look after the welfare of the subjects. This was not mere rhetoric. The emperor genuinely seemed to feel a paternal responsibility for the well-being of millions of people he would never meet. The Buddhist concept of interdependence had taken root in Ashoka's understanding. He came to see that his own happiness and security were inextricably linked to the happiness and security of his people. A ruler who oppressed his subjects was ultimately oppressing himself, creating the very conditions that would lead to his own downfall. Tissa watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. His student had grasped not just the intellectual content of Buddhist teachings, but their practical implications for daily life. The monk had seen many people claim to be followers of the Buddha while continuing to live in ways that contradicted everything the Enlightened One had taught. But Ashoka was different. He was genuinely attempting to embody the Dharma in every aspect of his existence. "Your Majesty," the monk said during one of their evening conversations, "you have discovered something that eludes many rulers. True power is not the ability to make others fear you, but the ability to inspire them to become their best selves." As word of Ashoka's transformation spread throughout the empire, the response was initially mixed. Some saw it as weakness, a dangerous departure from the strong-arm tactics that had built the Mauryan state. Others viewed it with suspicion, wondering if this was merely a new form of manipulation designed to lull potential rebels into complacency. But gradually, as the concrete benefits of Ashoka's policies became apparent, public opinion began to shift. Crime rates dropped in areas where the emperor's educational programs were implemented. Trade flourished under the more equitable commercial policies. Agricultural productivity increased as farmers were treated with greater respect and Hajin given more support. The change was particularly noticeable in the treatment of religious minorities. Previous rulers had often played different religious groups against each other, using sectarian tensions as a tool of control. But Ashoka's Dhamma emphasized tolerance and mutual respect. He did not preach any sectarian faith, but instead promoted values that members of all religions could embrace. Buddhist monks were honored, but so were Hindu priests, Jain teachers, and practitioners of local folk traditions. The emperor made it clear that while he personally followed Buddhist principles, he respected the sincere religious practice of all his subjects. This policy of tolerance created an unprecedented level of religious harmony throughout the empire. The transformation was not without its challenges. There were times when Ashoka's commitment to nonviolence was tested by practical realities. Border disputes, internal rebellions, and administrative corruption all required responses that sometimes seemed to conflict with pure Buddhist ideals. But the emperor learned to navigate these challenges with wisdom gained through meditation and consultation with his spiritual advisors. Rather than abandoning his principles when faced with difficult decisions, Ashoka developed what might be called a middle way approach to governance. He maintained the institutions necessary for effective rule while infusing them with ethical considerations that had been absent before. Justice was still administered, but with greater attention to rehabilitation than punishment. Military forces were maintained, but were used primarily for defense and disaster relief rather than conquest. The emperor's spiritual practice continued to deepen. He established regular retreats where he would spend days in intensive meditation, often emerging with insights that would influence imperial policy for years to come. His understanding of Buddhist philosophy became increasingly sophisticated, though he never lost sight of the practical applications that made the teachings relevant to governance. Whether Ashoka selected certain Buddhist texts on his own, or had the advice of his mentor, Tissa, his conception of Dhamma emphasized that it was a quality of a person rather than of doctrines or ideas. This personal approach to spirituality became a hallmark of his reign. as he consistently emphasized the importance of individual transformation over mere ritual observance. As the years passed, Ashoka's reputation as a wise and compassionate ruler spread far beyond the borders of his empire. Diplomatic missions arrived from distant lands, seeking to understand how this Indian emperor had achieved such remarkable prosperity and stability through methods that seemed to contradict everything traditional statecraft taught. The emperor would often meet with these foreign delegations personally, sharing not just the practical aspects of his policies, but the spiritual insights that had motivated them. Many of these visitors returned to their own countries with new ideas about governance, though few were able to implement them with the same success that Ashoka had achieved. The transformation from conqueror to Dharma ruler was now complete. The man who had once sought to expand his empire through violence now sought to expand it through the power of moral example. The emperor who had once measured success in terms of territory gained now measured it in terms of suffering alleviated. Standing in his palace gardens one evening, watching the sun set over the vast empire he had inherited through violence and was now governing through compassion, Ashoka reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The Buddha had taught that all conditioned existence was characterized by impermanence, suffering, and the absence of fixed self. But he had also taught that within this seemingly bleak reality lay the seeds of liberation. Ashoka had discovered that the same principle applied to governance. An empire built on force alone was inherently unstable, constantly threatened by the very violence that had created it. But an empire built on Dharma, on the recognition of universal values that transcended cultural and religious differences, could achieve a stability that no amount of military might could provide. The swords had indeed become prayers, not through weakness, but through the recognition that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to build something lasting and beautiful. The emperor who had once conquered through fear now ruled through love, and in doing so, he had discovered a form of power that no enemy could ever take away. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Ashoka felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path that had led him from the bloody fields of Kalinga to this moment of profound peace. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had taught him that the greatest conquests were not of territories, but of the human heart itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to apply the principles of Dharma to the complex realities of ruling a vast empire. But tonight, for the first time since Kalinga, Ashoka knew that he would sleep peacefully, his dreams filled not with images of war, but with visions of a world where compassion had triumphed over violence, where wisdom had conquered ignorance, and where the light of Dharma illuminated even the darkest corners of human existence. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world balanced on the edge between darkness and light, Emperor Ashoka stood in the imperial workshops of Pataliputra, watching artisans shape what would become monuments to human conscience. The air was thick with the dust of Chunar sandstone, that golden stone that would carry his message across centuries. Yet unborn, the idea had come to him during one of his meditative walks through the empire, when he witnessed a village elder teaching children beneath the shade of an ancient banyan tree. The old man's voice carried wisdom gathered over decades, but his words would die with him unless they were preserved somehow. Ashoka realized then that the transformation he had experienced needed to be shared not just with his generation, but with all generations to come. "Your Majesty," said the master craftsman, his hands still dusty from the stone, "the pillars will stand 40 feet tall, perhaps 50 in some cases. They will be visible from great distances, calling travelers to pause and reflect." Ashoka nodded, running his fingers along the smooth surface of a pillar shaft. These were not mere monuments to imperial power, but teachers carved in stone, silent, instructors that would speak to anyone who approached with an open heart. Each pillar would be a lighthouse of Dharma, casting its beam across the moral landscape of the empire. The emperor had decided that his message would be carved not just in the scholarly Sanskrit of the court, but in the local languages of the people. Prakrit, Aramaic, and Greek would carry his words to merchants, farmers, and pilgrims in scripts they could understand. This was revolutionary, for a ruler of his era. Most imperial decrees were issued in the language of power, not the language of the people. As the first pillar was erected in the Deer Park at Sarnath, where the Buddha had delivered his first sermon. Centuries earlier, Ashoka felt the weight of history converging in that moment. The spot where the Enlightened One had set in motion the wheel of Dharma would now bear witness to an emperor's attempt to turn that same wheel on a scale never before attempted. The lion capital that crowned the Sarnath pillar was itself a masterpiece of symbolic meaning. 4 lions stood back to back, their mouths open not in roars of aggression, but in the proclamation of Dharma to the 4 directions. Below them, carved in exquisite detail, were the symbols of the wheel, the bull, the horse, and the lion, representing, respectively, the Buddha's teaching, moral strength, the royal horse of spiritual conquest, and the courage to follow the path of righteousness. Let these lions roar not the sound of war, Ashoka instructed the craftsman, but the sound of Dharma. Let them call to every heart that seeks peace, every mind that yearns for wisdom, every soul that thirsts for truth. The creation of each pillar was a meditation in itself. The sandstone was quarried from the hills of Shunar, transported hundreds of miles by teams of oxen and elephants, shaped by skilled artisans who understood that they were not merely cutting stone, but carving the very essence of compassion into physical form. The pillars were monolithic, carved from single blocks of stone, symbolizing the unity of purpose that Ashoka hoped to bring to his diverse empire. As the network of pillars spread across the continent, each one became a focal point for the 5 communities that surrounded it. The inscriptions, written in the first person, spoke directly to the reader in Ashoka's own voice, creating an intimate connection between emperor and subject that transcended the usual barriers of hierarchy and distance. "All men are my children," read one inscription, the words carved with careful precision into the golden stone. "What I desire for my own children, and I desire their welfare and happiness, both in this world and the next, that I desire for all men." This was not the language of domination, but of loving responsibility. Ashoka had discovered that true imperial power lay not in the ability to command obedience through fear, but in the capacity to inspire virtue through example. Each pillar stood as a testament to this revolutionary understanding of leadership. Major rock edicts, carved into living stone formations across the empire, complemented the pillar inscriptions with more detailed explanations of Dharma. These were not mere pronouncements of policy, but intimate conversations between a ruler and his people, sharing the lessons he had learned through his own spiritual journey. Rock Edict 2 spoke of the practical applications of compassion everywhere. "Within my domain, and among the people beyond the borders, I have made provision for 2 types of medical treatment for humans and medical treatment for animals. Wherever medical herbs suitable for humans or animals are not available, I have had them imported and grown." This was Dharma in action, not merely philosophical speculation, but concrete measures to reduce suffering wherever it was found. The emperor, who had once delighted in the hunt, now established the first veterinary hospitals in recorded history, recognizing that the Buddha's teaching of compassion extended to all sentient beings. Another edict proclaimed the end of royal banquets, featuring meat, replacing them with gatherings focused on spiritual discourse and the sharing of wisdom. Formerly, in the kitchen of beloved of the gods, King Piyadasi, hundreds of thousands of animals were killed every day to make curry. But now, with the writing of this Dharma edict, only 3 creatures, 2 peacocks and a deer, are killed, and the deer not always. And in time, not even these three creatures will be killed. The pillars themselves became pilgrimage destinations, drawing travelers from across the known world. Buddhist monks would gather at their bases to chant sutras, while merchants would pause in their journeys to contemplate the emperor's words. Hindu priests found wisdom in the universal principles that Ashoka espoused, while Jain teachers appreciated his emphasis on nonviolence and respect for all life. The strategic placement of these monuments was carefully considered. They stood at crossroads where different cultures met, at the entrances to important cities, and at sites of religious significance. Each location was chosen to maximize the number of people who would encounter the message, creating a network of moral instruction that spanned the entire continent in the northwestern reaches of the empire, where Greek influence remained strong. From the time of Alexander's conquests, the edicts were carved in Greek and Aramaic. The Greek text used the word eusebeia for dharma, meaning piety or reverence, while the Aramaic employed concepts familiar to the Zoroastrian and Jewish communities that had settled in the region. This linguistic diversity was itself a form of dharma, the recognition that truth could be expressed in many forms while remaining essentially the same. Ashoka was not imposing a single religious tradition on his subjects, but rather identifying the common ethical ground that all sincere spiritual seekers shared. The emperor's personal involvement in the creation of these monuments was legendary. He would often visit the stone carvers personally, not to micromanage their work, but to ensure that the spirit of compassion was reflected in every chisel stroke. He understood that the manner in which something was created was as important as the thing itself. Let the craftsmen who carve these words, he instructed, pause before each letter to consider its meaning. Let them work not in haste, but in reverence, knowing that their hands are instruments of Dharma itself. The pillars and edicts also served as a form of governmental transparency, unprecedented in the ancient world. Through them, Ashoka shared not just his policies, but his reasoning behind them. He explained his mistakes, acknowledged his past errors, and described the spiritual journey that had led him to embrace nonviolence. One particularly moving inscription revealed the emperor's ongoing struggle with the practical challenges of governance. There is no better work than promoting the welfare of all the people, and whatever efforts I am making is to repay the debt I owe to all beings, to assure their happiness in this life and attain heaven in the next. This was not the voice of a distant autocrat, but of a man wrestling with the weight of responsibility for millions of lives. The pillars became confessionals where Ashoka bore his soul to his people, sharing his doubts and discoveries with remarkable candor. The impact of these monuments extended far beyond their immediate purpose. They established a precedent for the use of public art as a means of moral instruction, influencing architectural and artistic traditions for centuries to come. The technology required to quarry, transport, and erect these massive stones spurred innovations in engineering and logistics that benefited the entire empire. Local communities took pride in their pillars, incorporating them into festivals and ceremonies that celebrated the values they represented. Children grew up playing in their shadows, absorbing the principles of Dharma through daily familiarity with the emperor's words. The pillars became part of the landscape, as natural and enduring as the mountains and rivers that surrounded them. As reports reached Pataliputra of the pillars' reception throughout the empire, Ashoka felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal glory. He had discovered a way to multiply his presence, to extend his teaching voice across vast distances without diminishing its power. Each pillar was an extension of his own commitment to Dharma, a permanent reminder that leadership was ultimately about service to others. The inscriptions also revealed the emperor's understanding of the interconnectedness of all life. He wrote of protecting not just humans, but animals, plants, and even the environment itself. Royal hunting preserves were converted into sanctuaries where wildlife could live without fear. Gardens were planted not just for beauty, but to provide habitat for birds and shelter for travelers. On the roads, I have had banyan trees planted so that they can give shade to animals and men, read one edict. I have had mango groves planted, and I have had wells dug and rest houses built every 8 miles. I have had many watering places made for the use of animals and men. This holistic vision of governance recognized that human welfare could not be separated from the health of the natural world. The emperor who had once conquered through violence now sought to heal the very earth that had been scarred by his armies. The pillar at Lumbini, marking the birthplace of the Buddha, carried a particularly poignant message. Ashoka had made a pilgrimage there 20 years after his coronation, and the inscription commemorated not just the historical significance of the site, but the emperor's own spiritual birth through his encounter with Buddhist teachings. King Piyadasi, beloved of the gods, having been anointed 20 years, came himself and worshipped this spot because the Buddha Sakyamuni was born here. He caused to be made a stone bearing a horse and a stone pillar, because the Lord was born. Here, the village of Lumbini was freed from taxes and required to pay only 1/8 of the produce. The practical benefit granted to the village freedom from taxation demonstrated that Dharma was not merely a private spiritual practice, but a public commitment to reducing the burdens that government might impose on its citizens. As the sun set over the empire, painting the sandstone pillars in shades of gold and amber, Ashoka often reflected on the legacy he was creating. These monuments would outlast his dynasty, outlast his empire, outlast perhaps even the memory of his name. But the principles they embodied: compassion, nonviolence, tolerance, and the recognition of our shared humanity. These would endure as long as human beings walked the earth. The pillars had become more than monuments. They were teachers, counselors, and friends to all who encountered them. In their silent presence, the emperor's voice would continue to speak across the centuries, reminding future generations that true power lay not in the ability to dominate others, but in the wisdom to serve them. Standing in his palace gardens one evening, looking out toward the distant pillars that dotted his empire like stars in the landscape, Ashoka felt the deep satisfaction of a teacher whose lessons had found their permanent home. The Dharma he had discovered through his own suffering and transformation was now carved in stone, proof against the erosion of time and the forgetfulness of human nature. The pillars stood as silent sentinels of compassion, their message as relevant to future generations as it was to his own, that the highest form of conquest was the conquest of one's own heart, that the greatest empire was the empire of love, and that the most enduring monuments were those built not from stone and mortar, but from the eternal principles of wisdom and kindness that connected all beings in their shared journey toward enlightenment. In the gathering darkness, the pillars seemed to glow with their own inner light, beacons of hope in a world that had known too much violence and too little understanding. They were Ashoka's gift to the future, not just records of his reign, but invitations to every person who would ever read them to join in the eternal work of building a more compassionate world. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day, imagine yourself walking through the ancient courtyards of Pataliputra, the jewel of the Mauryan Empire. The air carries the soft scent of jasmine and sandalwood, mingling with the distant sound of temple bells echoing across the Ganges River. Here, in this sacred space, where marble columns reach toward the heavens like prayers made stone, we find ourselves witnessing one of history's most remarkable transformations. The year is 250 BCE, and Emperor Ashoka stands in his private meditation chamber, a man utterly changed from the fierce warrior we once knew. The early morning light filters through latticed windows, casting gentle patterns on the floor where he kneels in contemplation. His once powerful hands, which had commanded armies and wielded the sword of conquest, now rest peacefully in his lap fingertips touching in the ancient mantra of inner peace. But this morning is different. Today, Ashoka will make a decision that will ripple across continents and through centuries, touching lives in ways he cannot yet imagine. The Emperor rises slowly, his movements deliberate and mindful, each step a meditation in itself. He has been preparing for this moment for months, perhaps years, ever since the horrific memories of Kalinga began to transform from sources of torment into wellsprings of compassion. Walking through the corridors of his palace, Ashoka passes the familiar frescoes depicting the Buddha's life, scenes of enlightenment painted in soft blues and golds that seem to glow in the morning light. These images have become his teachers, their silent wisdom guiding him toward a truth he never expected to find. The Buddha's eyes, painted with such skill they seem alive, follow him as he moves, offering the same gentle acceptance that first touched his heart in those dark days after the war. In the Great Hall, where once he planned military campaigns, Ashoka now gathers a different kind of assembly. The room fills with Buddhist monks, their saffron robes flowing like autumn leaves in the gentle breeze from the gardens. Among them are men and women who have dedicated their lives to the Dharma, the eternal teaching of compassion and wisdom. Their faces reflect the same inner peace that Ashoka has come to cherish, the same quiet strength that comes from understanding the true nature of existence. The Emperor takes his place not on the golden throne of his ancestors, but on a simple cushion placed at the same level as his guests. This gesture speaks volumes about the man he has become. Power, he has learned, is not about elevation above others, but about service to all beings. As he settles into meditation posture, the room fills with a profound silence, the kind of stillness that comes when hearts are unified in common purpose. When Ashoka finally speaks, his voice carries the weight of genuine conviction, soft yet clear as mountain water. He tells those gathered about a vision that has been growing in his heart, a dream of sharing the Buddha's teachings, not just within the borders of his empire, but across all the known world. The Dharma, he explains, is like a gentle river that longs to reach the sea. It must flow freely, touching every shore, nourishing every land it encounters. But this will not be conquest in the old sense. There will be no armies, no forced conversions, no destruction of local customs and beliefs. Instead, Ashoka proposes something revolutionary, something the world has never seen before. Missions of pure compassion, carried by volunteers who seek nothing for themselves but the joy of sharing what they have found. The first mission, closest to his heart, will be led by his own son, Mahinda, a young man who has embraced the monastic life with the same intensity his father once brought to warfare. The destination is the island kingdom of Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, where King Devanampiya Tissa rules with wisdom and justice. The journey will be long and dangerous, crossing the turbulent waters of the Indian Ocean. But Mahinda accepts the challenge with the serene confidence of one who has found his true calling. His plans unfold. Ashoka speaks of his daughter, Sangamita, who will join her brother in this sacred mission. She will carry with her something precious beyond measure, a cutting from the original Bodhi tree, the very tree under which the Buddha achieved enlightenment centuries ago. This living symbol of awakening will be planted in Sri Lankan soil, creating a bridge between the land of the Buddha's birth and the hearts of those who long for peace. The preparation for these missions becomes a meditation in itself. Ashoka watches as scrolls are carefully copied, each letter formed with the reverence of a prayer. These contain the Buddha's teachings, translated into the languages of distant lands, each word chosen with care to preserve the essential meaning while speaking to local hearts. The Emperor personally oversees the selection of gifts, not the gold and jewels that might impress earthly rulers, but simple offerings that carry deeper meaning. Lotus seeds from the sacred lakes of India, meditation bells cast in the finest bronze, and small statues of the Buddha crafted with such skill they seem to breathe with inner life. But the missions to Ceylon, though dear to his heart, are only the beginning. Ashoka's vision extends far beyond the island kingdom. He speaks of the great trade routes that connect his empire to the distant lands of Central Asia, pathways carved by merchants and adventurers who brave mountain passes and desert crossings in pursuit of silk and spices. These same routes, he realizes, can carry something far more precious than any material treasure. The Silk Road, that legendary network of paths stretching from India to China, from the Mediterranean to the steppes of Mongolia, becomes in Ashoka's imagination a river of Dharma. He envisions Buddhist monks traveling these ancient highways, their simple robes and peaceful demeanor creating ripples of curiosity and respect wherever they go. They will not be merchants seeking profit, but pilgrims sharing the wealth of inner peace. In the northwestern regions of his empire, where the Hindu Kush mountains rise like sleeping giants against the sky, Ashoka establishes monasteries that will serve as way stations for these traveling teachers. The monks who volunteer for these missions are carefully chosen, not for their scholarly achievements alone, but for their ability to embody the Dharma in their daily lives. They must be living examples of the Buddha's teachings, their presence alone a sermon more powerful than any words. They might speak. The emperor knows that each culture they encounter will be different, with its own gods, its own customs, its own understanding of the sacred. He instructs his missionaries to approach each new land with respect and humility, to learn before they teach, to find the common ground that exists in every human heart. The Buddha's message, he tells them, is universal because it speaks to the universal human experience of suffering and the universal human longing for peace. As the first groups of missionaries prepare to depart, Ashoka performs a ritual blessing that brings tears to the eyes of all who witness it. Standing in the palace gardens at sunset, with the Ganges flowing gently in the distance, he places his hands on the head of each departing monk and nun. His touch conveys not the authority of an emperor, but the love of a father sending his children into the world to do good. The moment of departure is both solemn and joyful. The missionaries carry with them not just their few personal possessions, but the hopes and prayers of an entire empire. They will face dangers that would terrify ordinary mortals: bandits in the mountain passes, storms at sea, diseases in foreign lands, and the constant challenge of communicating across vast cultural divides. Yet they go forward with light hearts, sustained by the knowledge that they carry something that can transform any darkness they might encounter. From the palace walls, Ashoka watches the first caravan disappear into the morning mist. The wagons carry no weapons, no treasure in the conventional sense. Yet the emperor knows they bear the most powerful force in the universe: the simple truth that all beings deserve compassion, that suffering can be overcome, that peace is possible. In the months that follow, reports begin to filter back to the capital. A letter arrives from the mountains of Gandhara, describing how local chieftains have welcomed the Buddhist teachers and asked to learn more about their gentle philosophy. Another message comes from the trading post of Bamiyan, where a magnificent statue of the Buddha has been carved into the cliff face, its serene features gazing out over the ancient caravan routes with eternal patience. The news from Ceylon brings special joy to Ashoka's heart. His son Mahinda has been welcomed by King Devanampiya Tissa with honors usually reserved for visiting royalty. The Bodhi tree cutting has been planted in the royal gardens, where it grows strong and green, its leaves rustling with the promise of future enlightenment. The king himself has embraced the Buddhist path along with thousands of his subjects, creating a flourishing community of practitioners on the island. But perhaps the most moving reports come from the ordinary people touched by these missions. A trader from the western provinces writes of meeting Buddhist monks in the markets of Bactria, where their presence has created an atmosphere of unusual peace and honesty. Arguments that once led to bloodshed are now settled through patient dialogue. Merchants who once cheated their customers now take pride in fair dealing, understanding that their own peace of mind depends on the well-being of others. From the coastal regions come stories of fishing villages where the Buddhist teaching of nonviolence has led to new ways of life. Fishermen who once depleted the waters through excessive harvesting now practice sustainable methods, taking only what they need and leaving the rest for future generations. The ocean itself seems to respond to this new consciousness, providing more abundant catches for those who fish with respect and gratitude. The missions to Southeast Asia prove especially fruitful. The lands beyond the great mountains, where the Mekong River winds through lush forests and ancient temples, welcome the Buddhist teachers with open arms. Here, the Dharma finds soil that has been prepared by centuries of indigenous wisdom traditions. The local people, already skilled in meditation and mindful living, recognize in Buddhism a kindred spirit that speaks to their deepest aspirations. In the kingdom of Funan, in what will one day be called Cambodia, Buddhist monks establish schools where children learn not just reading and writing, but the art of peaceful living. The young students, their bright eyes shining with curiosity, absorb the Buddha's teachings like flowers drinking morning dew. They learn to resolve conflicts through understanding rather than force, to see the interconnectedness of all life, to find joy in simple pleasures and contentment in modest circumstances. The coastal cities of Southeast Asia, bustling with maritime trade, become unexpected centers of Buddhist learning. Merchants who once concerned themselves only with profit begin to see their work as opportunities for service. Ships that once carried only goods now also transport Buddhist texts and teachers, spreading the Dharma along the ancient sea routes that connect India with the Spice Islands and the markets of the East. In the port of Tamralipti, on the eastern coast of India, Ashoka establishes a special harbor for these missionary voyages. Here, ships are blessed before departure, their crews taught the principles of compassionate living that will guide them through the dangers of the open sea. The harbor master, himself a devoted Buddhist, ensures that every vessel carries not just the supplies needed for the journey, but also the spiritual resources that will sustain the missionaries in their sacred work. As the years pass, Ashoka's vision begins to manifest in ways that exceed even his greatest hopes. The Buddhist missions become a network of light stretching across the known world, each monastery and temple a beacon of wisdom and compassion. The emperor receives reports of stupas being built in the mountains of Afghanistan, of meditation, centers flourishing in the oases of Central Asia, of entire communities in distant lands embracing the path of nonviolence and mindful living. But the true measure of success is not in the numbers of converts or the grandeur of the temples built. It is in the subtle changes that ripple through society like gentle waves on a peaceful lake. In the marketplaces of Taxila, disputes are settled through mediation rather than litigation. In the villages of Masada, neighbors who once competed for scarce resources now work together to ensure that everyone has enough. In the imperial court itself, decisions are made not based on political advantage, but on what will bring the greatest good to the greatest number of beings. The emperor himself continues to deepen his own practice, spending hours each day in meditation and study. He corresponds personally with the leaders of the various missions, offering guidance and encouragement while learning from their experiences in foreign lands. Each letter that arrives at the palace is treasured like a gem, carrying news of the Dharma's progress and the challenges faced by those who have dedicated their lives to its spread. One particularly cherished letter comes from a group of monks working in the kingdoms of Central Asia. They write of encountering Zoroastrian priests, followers of the ancient Persian religion, who have found common ground with Buddhist teachings in their shared emphasis on ethical living and the struggle between light and darkness. Rather than competing with these local traditions, the Buddhist missionaries have learned to work alongside them, finding ways to honor both paths. while sharing the unique insights of the Buddhist teachings. This spirit of cooperation and mutual respect becomes a hallmark of Ashoka's missionary enterprise. Unlike the religious conquests that would characterize later centuries, these early Buddhist missions succeed precisely because they refuse to dominate. They come not as conquerors, but as friends, not as critics of local customs, but as fellow seekers of truth. This approach opens doors that might otherwise remain closed, creating lasting bonds between cultures that might otherwise remain strangers. The Emperor's own transformation continues to deepen as he witnesses the fruits of these missions. The man who once found meaning in conquest now discovers a far greater satisfaction in the quiet victories of the spirit. Each report of a former enemy embracing peace, each story of a violent conflict resolved through Buddhist mediation, each account of a community learning to live in harmony with its neighbors brings him a joy that surpasses any pleasure he once found in military triumph. In the gardens of his palace, Ashoka creates a special sanctuary dedicated to the success of the missions. Here, among flowering trees and trickling fountains, he places small monuments representing each land touched by the Dharma. A piece of stone from the Afghan mountains, a shell from the Ceylon coast, a branch from the forests of Southeast Asia. Each artifact serves as a reminder of the bonds being forged between his empire and the wider world. The sanctuary becomes a place of pilgrimage for visitors from the various mission territories. Monks returning from distant lands come here to rest and reflect, to share their experiences and receive guidance for future journeys. The emperor often joins these informal gatherings, sitting in simple robes among the travelers, his imperial dignity set aside in favor of the deeper brotherhood of the Dharma. These conversations in the garden sanctuary reveal the profound changes taking place across Asia. A monk from the Greek kingdoms of Bactria describes how Buddhist philosophy has found resonance with Greek concepts of ethics and virtue. Local rulers, many of them descendants of Alexander's generals, have begun to incorporate Buddhist principles into their governance, creating hybrid forms of administration that combine Hellenistic efficiency with Buddhist compassion. From the Yao trade routes come reports of caravans where Buddhist and non-Buddhist merchants travel together in harmony. Their shared commitment to honest dealing, creating bonds of trust that transcend religious differences. The ancient highways, once notorious for banditry and conflict, become safer and more peaceful as the influence of Buddhist teaching spreads among the various tribes and kingdoms along the way. The maritime missions prove equally successful. Ships carrying Buddhist monks and texts regularly sail from Indian ports to the kingdoms of Southeast Asia, returning with stories of warm welcomes and eager students. The monsoon winds that once simply determined the timing of trade voyages now also carry the schedule of spiritual exchange, with the Dharma flowing as regularly as the seasonal rains. In the kingdom of Srivijaya, centered on the island of Sumatra, Buddhist teachings find especially fertile ground. The local rulers, already skilled in maritime trade and diplomacy, recognize the practical value of Buddhist ethics in their far-flung empire. Merchants who practice nonviolence and honest dealing prove more reliable trading partners, while the Buddhist emphasis on harmony and cooperation helps to unite the diverse peoples of the archipelago. The missions to the north, following the great mountain passes into Central Asia, face different challenges but achieve equally remarkable results. Here, in the harsh landscape of the Hindu Kush and the Pamirs, Buddhist monasteries become oases of learning and compassion. The monks who settle in these remote regions must be hardy as well as wise, capable of surviving extreme weather and isolation while maintaining their spiritual practices. Yet even in these forbidding landscapes, the Dharma takes root. Nomadic tribes that once lived by raiding and warfare begin to adopt Buddhist principles of nonviolence and compassion. The great fortress cities of Bactria and Sogdiana, once known primarily for their military prowess, become centers of Buddhist learning, and art. The fusion of local traditions with Buddhist teaching creates new forms of expression. From the magnificent cave temples of Bamiyan to the delicate sculptures that blend Greek artistic techniques with Buddhist spiritual themes, out as the sun sets over the gardens of Pataliputra, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ashoka stands once more in contemplation. The reports from the missions had exceeded his wildest dreams, yet he knows that the true measure of success lies not in the external achievements, but in the inner transformation of countless individuals. Each person who has found peace through the Dharma represents a victory more precious than any territorial conquest. The emperor's own evening meditation has become a practice of gratitude as he mentally visits each of the mission territories, offering thanks for the courage of the missionaries and the openness of those who have received their teachings. In his mind's eye, he sees the vast network of light that now connects his empire to the wider world. Each monastery and temple a node in a web of compassion that spans continents. The gentle bells of the palace temple begin to sound, calling the faithful to evening prayers. As their bronze voices echo across the city and over the flowing Ganges, Ashoka knows that similar sounds are rising from Buddhist communities across Asia. In Ceylon, where his son Mahinda now serves as a beloved teacher, the evening chants are being offered in Sinhalese voices. In the mountains of Afghanistan, monks are gathering for meditation in caves carved from living rock. In the trading cities of Central Asia, merchants are ending their day with expressions of gratitude and goodwill. This is the true empire that Ashoka has built, not through the force of arms, but through the power of example. It is an empire of the heart, with boundaries that shift and expand as more souls discover the path of peace. Unlike the empires of conquest that rise and fall with the fortunes of war, this empire of compassion promises to endure, passing from teacher to student, from generation to generation, carrying the gentle light of the Buddha's wisdom into the infinite future dot in the deepening twilight. As the first stars appear in the darkening sky, Ashoka offers a final prayer of dedication. May all beings, he whispers, in this world and in worlds beyond imagining, find the peace that comes from understanding their true nature. May the Dharma continue to spread like ripples on an endless ocean, touching every shore, reaching every heart, until all suffering has been transformed into wisdom, all hatred into love, all confusion into the clear light of awakening. The emperor's prayer joins the evening chorus of similar dedications rising from countless voices across the Buddhist world. In temples and monasteries, in merchant camps and village shrines, in the hearts of ordinary people going about their daily lives, the same aspiration echoes. May all beings be happy. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings discover the path that leads to lasting peace. As the night deepens and the palace grows quiet, Ashoka makes his way to his private chambers, his heart filled with the profound satisfaction of a life well lived. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, new ways to manifest the Dharma in the world. But tonight, he rests in the knowledge that he has played his part in something greater than himself, something that will continue long after his own voice has fallen silent. The gentle missions of the Buddha continue their work, carried by the winds of compassion across the vast reaches of Asia. In the eternal dance of giving and receiving, of teaching and learning, of serving and being served, the Dharma finds its way into every corner of the human heart, bringing light to the darkness, peace to the troubled, and hope to all who seek a better way to live. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world prepares for another day of possibility, the legacy of Ashoka's great missions continues to unfold. Like seeds carried by the wind, the teachings of compassion take root wherever they find fertile ground, growing into forests of wisdom that will shade and nourish countless generations yet to come. In the gentle pre-dawn darkness of Pataliputra, When the world rests in that sacred space between night and day, imagine the great palace of Emperor Ashoka beginning to stir with quiet purpose. The marble corridors, cooled by the night air and scented with jasmine from the imperial gardens, echo softly with the measured footsteps of servants preparing for another day in the most remarkable court the ancient world has ever known. This is not the brutal palace of conquest we might expect from an empire that spans half the known world. Instead, it is a place where the gentle philosophy of the Buddha has transformed the very nature of power itself. As the first rays of sunlight filter through the latticed windows, casting intricate patterns of light and shadow on the polished floors, we witness the dawn of a new kind of governance, one that places the welfare of all beings at the center of imperial policy. The emperor himself rises before the sun, as has become his custom since his transformation after the Kalinga War. His private chambers, once decorated with the spoils of military victory, now display only simple Buddhist artwork and texts. The walls bear frescoes depicting the life of the Buddha, painted in soft earth tones that speak of humility rather than grandeur. Here, in this sanctuary of contemplation, Ashoka begins each day with an hour of meditation, his mind turning inward, to find the peace that must flow outward, to touch every corner of his vast domain. The daily routine of the imperial court has been revolutionized by Ashoka's commitment to the Dharma. Where once the morning audiences were dominated by military briefings and reports of territorial expansion, now they begin with updates from a remarkable new class of officials, the Dhamma Mahamatras. These ministers of moral welfare represent perhaps the most innovative administrative concept in ancient history. Public servants whose primary duty is not to collect taxes or maintain order, but to ensure the spiritual and ethical well-being of the people. As the court assembles in the Great Hall, the transformation becomes immediately apparent. The throne room, once designed to intimidate with its display of imperial power, has been redesigned to emphasize accessibility and humility. The golden throne of Ashoka's ancestors has been replaced with a simple elevated platform, comfortable enough for the emperor, but no more elaborate than the seating provided for his ministers and advisors. A message is clear. This is a place of service, not domination. The Dhamma Mahamatras arrive for their morning briefing, their simple white robes a stark contrast to the elaborate military uniforms and court dress of earlier times. These officials, carefully selected not for their wealth or family connections, but for their moral character and dedication to the Buddhist principles of compassion and nonviolence, represent a revolutionary approach to governance. Their reports to the emperor speak not of conquered territories or tribute collected, but of hospitals built, rest houses established for travelers, and meditation conducted between feuding neighbors. One of the senior Dhamma Mahamatras, a former military officer, named Sanjaya, whose own transformation mirrors that of his emperor, steps forward to present his weekly report. He speaks of visiting remote villages where Buddhist teachings have taken root, of farmers who have adopted non-violent methods of pest control, and of merchants who have embraced honest dealing as a spiritual practice. His voice carries the quiet satisfaction of one who has found deeper meaning in service than he ever discovered in warfare. The emperor listens with the focused attention of a devoted student, asking questions that reveal his genuine concern for the welfare of his subjects. When Sanjaya mentions a dispute between two villages over water rights, Ashoka immediately assigns additional resources to mediate the conflict, emphasizing that the goal is not simply to impose a solution, but to help both communities find a path forward that honors the dignity of all involved. This approach, revolutionary in its time, reflects the emperor's understanding that true governance must address not just the material needs of people, but their spiritual aspirations as well. The morning audiences continue with reports from provincial governors, but even these traditional administrative updates have been transformed by Ashoka's new vision. Where once the emphasis was on tax collection and military readiness, now the focus is on the construction of hospitals, the establishment of botanical gardens for medicinal plants, and the creation of public works projects that reflect Buddhist values of compassion and environmental stewardship. The emperor has mandated that wells be dug at regular intervals along the major roads, that shade trees be planted for the comfort of travelers, and that rest houses be built where pilgrims and merchants can find shelter regardless of their ability to pay. The court scribes, working at elegant wooden desks positioned around the hall, document these proceedings with the same meticulous care once reserved for military dispatches. But their records now tell a different story, one of an empire learning to measure its success not by the fear it inspires in its enemies, but by the contentment of its citizens. The daily chronicles speak of irrigation projects that have brought prosperity to previously barren regions, of schools where children learn not just reading and writing, but the principles of ethical living, and of markets where fair dealing has become the norm rather than the exception. As the morning session draws to a close, Ashoka rises to make his daily inspection tour of the capital. This practice, which he has maintained for over a decade, reflects his belief that a ruler must remain connected to the lives of ordinary people. Unlike the heavily guarded processions of traditional monarchs, Ashoka's tours are conducted with minimal ceremony, allowing him to observe the daily rhythms of his city without the elaborate protocols that might prevent honest communication with his subjects. The streets of Pataliputra, through which the emperor walks, tell the story of a society in transition. The grand military barracks that once dominated the cityscape have been converted into centers of learning and healing. The former weapons factories now produce agricultural tools and medical instruments. The great parade grounds where armies, once drilled for conquest, have been transformed into public gardens where families gather for festivals and children play in safety. In the marketplace, Ashoka pauses to observe the daily commerce that sustains his empire. The merchants who approach him do so without the fear that once characterized such encounters. They speak freely of their concerns and aspirations, knowing that their emperor genuinely cares about their welfare. A textile merchant named Kamila, her stall bright with silk and cotton from across the empire, mentions the difficulty of maintaining fair prices during the monsoon season when transport becomes challenging. Rather than dismissing her concern or referring her to lower officials, Ashoka engages in a thoughtful discussion about ways the imperial administration might support merchants during difficult periods. The emperor's interest in such mundane matters might seem unusual for a ruler of his stature, but it reflects his deep understanding that the Dharma must be lived in the practical details of daily life. The Buddhist teaching of interconnectedness means that the welfare of a single merchant in Pataliputra is connected to the prosperity of the entire empire. By attending to these small concerns with the same seriousness he once brought to military strategy, Ashoka demonstrates the radical nature of his transformation. The afternoon hours find the emperor in his private study, a chamber lined with scrolls and manuscripts that reflect his voracious appetite for learning. Here, surrounded by Buddhist texts, administrative reports, and correspondence from distant provinces, he works on one of his most important innovations, the royal edicts that will carry his message of Dharma to every corner of his empire and beyond. These inscriptions, carved in stone and metal, represent perhaps the world's first systematic attempt to communicate a moral philosophy directly to the people. The process of creating these edicts reveals the careful thought that goes into every aspect of Ashoka's governance. Each message is crafted to speak to the common experiences of his subjects, addressing their concerns about family relationships, business ethics, and community harmony. The emperor personally reviews every word, ensuring that the language is accessible to ordinary people while remaining true to the profound teachings of the Buddha. One edict currently under development addresses the treatment of animals, a concern That has become central to Ashoka's philosophy of non-violence. The text carefully explains why the imperial court has reduced the number of animals killed for royal feasts, why certain species are now protected from hunting, and why the emperor encourages all subjects to adopt more compassionate practices toward the creatures that share their world. The tone is not commanding but persuasive, appealing to the natural compassion that Ashoka believes exists in every human heart. The emperor's personal transformation is perhaps most visible in his approach to the evening court sessions. Where once these gatherings were dominated by military planning and political maneuvering, they now focus on cultural and spiritual matters. Buddhist monks from across the empire gather to share their teachings, while scholars and artists present their latest works. The atmosphere is one of learning and contemplation rather than intrigue and ambition. The evening meals at the imperial court reflect the same transformation. The elaborate banquets of earlier times, with their excessive consumption of meat and wine, have been replaced by simple vegetarian meals that honor the Buddhist principle of nonviolence toward all living beings. The emperor himself serves as an example, taking only what he needs and ensuring that no food is wasted. These meals become opportunities for meaningful conversation about philosophy, ethics, and the challenges of governing according to Dharma principles. The physical environment of the palace has been redesigned to support this new approach to imperial life. The war room, once the most important chamber in the complex, has been converted into a meditation hall where the emperor and his advisors begin each day with collective contemplation. The walls that once displayed maps of military campaigns now show artistic depictions of the Buddhist teachings, creating an atmosphere of peace and reflection that influences every decision made within these walls. The emperor's private apartments reveal the depth of his personal transformation. The luxurious furnishings of his early reign have been replaced with simple, functional items that reflect Buddhist values of moderation and mindfulness. His bedroom contains only a modest bed, a meditation cushion, and a small shrine with a statue of the Buddha. The elaborate wardrobe of royal regalia has been reduced to a few simple robes suitable for different occasions, all designed to emphasize the emperor's role as a servant of the Dharma rather than a collector of worldly pleasures. The daily schedule of the imperial court has been restructured around the natural rhythms of contemplative life. The early morning hours are reserved for meditation and personal reflection, while the late morning is devoted to administrative duties and public audiences. The afternoon brings time for study and correspondence, and the evening is given to cultural activities and spiritual instruction. This rhythm, so different from the frenetic pace of military campaigns and political plotting, creates space for the kind of thoughtful decision-making that has become the hallmark of Ashoka's reign. The emperor's relationship with his family has also been transformed by his commitment to the Dharma. His children, including the son and daughter, who have dedicated their lives to spreading Buddhism beyond the empire's borders, have been raised with an understanding that their royal birth brings not privilege but responsibility. The imperial household has become a model of the kind of family life that Ashoka hopes to promote throughout his empire, one based on mutual respect, compassion, and shared commitment to ethical living. The servants and officials who work in the palace notice the change in atmosphere that has accompanied Ashoka's transformation. Where once the court was a place of tension and fear, where a wrong word or gesture might result in punishment or death, it has become a community of shared purpose. The emperor's genuine care for the welfare of others has created a culture of service that extends from the highest ministers to the humblest kitchen workers. This transformation extends to the emperor's approach to justice and law enforcement. The harsh punishments that characterized earlier periods have been replaced with a system that emphasizes rehabilitation and reconciliation. The imperial prisons, once places of cruelty and despair, have been converted into centers where wrongdoers can learn, Buddhist principles and develop the inner qualities that will prevent future transgressions. The emperor regularly visits these facilities, not to inspect their security, but to assure that the inmates are being treated with dignity and given genuine opportunities for moral development. The economic policies of the empire have also been reshaped by Buddhist principles. The heavy taxation that once funded military expansion has been redirected toward public works projects that benefit all citizens. The imperial treasury, no longer needed to maintain vast armies, is invested in hospitals, schools, and infrastructure projects that improve the quality of life for ordinary people. The emperor has discovered that an empire based on the voluntary cooperation of contented subjects is far more stable and prosperous than one maintained through fear and coercion. The artistic and cultural life of the empire has flourished under Ashoka's patronage. The court artists and musicians, freed from the obligation to glorify military victories, have turned their talents to celebrating the beauty of peaceful life and the wisdom of the Buddhist teachings. The palace walls are adorned with paintings that depict scenes of family harmony, agricultural abundance, and spiritual contemplation. The music performed at court ceremonies emphasizes themes of compassion, wisdom, and the interconnectedness of all beings. The imperial library, once focused primarily on military manuals and political treatises, has been expanded to include works on philosophy, medicine, agriculture, and the arts. The emperor himself spends hours each day reading and studying, recognizing that effective governance requires not just administrative skill but deep understanding of human nature and the principles that lead to genuine happiness and prosperity. His personal collection of Buddhist texts has become one of the most comprehensive in the ancient world, reflecting his commitment to understanding the Dharma in all its complexity and subtlety. The daily rhythm of the imperial court concludes each evening with a practice that would have been unthinkable in earlier times: a collective meditation involving the emperor, his ministers, and the palace staff. This gathering, held in the former war room now converted to a meditation hall, brings together people from all levels of the imperial hierarchy in a shared commitment to inner peace and ethical living. The emperor, seated not on an elevated throne but at the same level as everyone else, leads the session with the same humility and sincerity that characterizes all aspects of his transformed life. As the evening deepens and the palace settles into quiet, Ashoka makes his final rounds of the day. He visits the quarters where visiting monks are staying, ensuring that their needs are met and listening to their teachings. He checks on the facilities where the poor and sick receive treatment, observing the care they receive and making notes about improvements that might be made. He ends his day as he began it, in solitary meditation, reflecting on the events of the day and setting his intentions for the challenges that tomorrow will bring. The transformation of the imperial court under Ashoka represents more than a change in political style. It is a fundamental reimagining of the purpose of government itself. Where other empires exist to serve the ambitions of their rulers, Ashoka's empire exists to serve the Dharma, to create conditions in which all beings can flourish and find peace. The daily life of the court, with its emphasis on compassion, wisdom, and service, provides a model for the kind of society that becomes possible when power is exercised with humility and genuine care for the welfare of all. The emperor's personal example has created ripple effects throughout the empire. Provincial governors, inspired by Ashoka's dedication to ethical governance, have reformed their own administrations along similar lines. Local officials, seeing the emperor's commitment to the welfare of ordinary people, have adopted more compassionate approaches to their duties. The entire structure of imperial government has been transformed from an instrument of domination into a means of service, creating a legacy that will inspire rulers and social reformers for centuries to come. In the quiet hours before dawn, as the palace prepares for another day of service to the Dharma, the profound nature of Ashoka's achievement becomes clear. He has demonstrated that even the mightiest empire can be transformed by the power of compassion, that the principles of Buddhism can be applied not just to personal spiritual development, but to the complex challenges of governing a diverse and far-flung realm. The daily life of his court, with its emphasis on moral development, public service, and genuine care for the welfare of all beings, stands as a testament to the possibility of creating a more just and compassionate world. The legacy of this transformation extends far beyond the borders of the Mauryan Empire. The principles of ethical governance that Ashoka has developed will influence political thought for millennia, inspiring leaders in many cultures and historical periods to seek ways of exercising power that honor the dignity and promote the welfare of all people. The daily rhythms of the imperial court, with their emphasis on reflection, service, and moral development, provide a model for how any organization or community might be structured to support the highest aspirations of its members. As the night deepens and the palace settles into peaceful rest, the emperor's vision of a society based on Dharma continues to work its quiet transformation. In the hearts of his subjects, in the practices of his administrators, and in the policies of his government, the seeds of a more compassionate world continue to grow. The daily life of the court, with all its careful attention to moral principle and genuine concern for the welfare of others, remains a beacon of hope for all who dream of creating a world in which power serves love rather than love serving power. The autumn wind carried the scent of fading lotus blossoms across the palace gardens of Pataliputra, where once the great Ashoka had walked in meditation beneath the ancient banyan trees. Now, 50 years after his passing, those same gardens seem to echo with the whispers of a dying dynasty, their carefully tended paths grown wild with neglect, their stone benches cracked and weathered by seasons of indifference. In the royal chambers where Ashoka had once pondered the mysteries of Dharma and composed his immortal edicts, his descendant Brihadrata sat hunched over scrolls that bore nothing but bad news. The lamplight flickered across his weathered face, revealing the burden of a man who had inherited an empire, but not the wisdom to preserve it. Outside his window, the great city of Pataliputra still bustled with life, but even the most casual observer could sense the underlying current of uncertainty that flowed through its streets like an underground river. The irony was not lost on those who remembered the glory days of Ashoka's reign. The very virtues that had made the great emperor beloved, his commitment to nonviolence, his emphasis on moral governance, his reluctance to use force even when necessary, had become the seeds of his dynasty's undoing. In a world where neighboring kingdoms measured strength by the sharpness of their swords and the size of their armies, the Mauryan commitment to peaceful rule had begun to appear not as enlightened leadership, but as dangerous weakness. Brihadrata's grandfather had been a man of peace, but his descendants had not inherited his profound understanding of when mercy was strength and when it was simply naivety. The later Mauryan rulers had maintained the outward forms of Ashoka's dharmic governance while lacking the inner transformation that had made his rule so powerful. They spoke of compassion while remaining distant from their subjects. They preached nonviolence while failing to address the growing corruption within their own administration. The provinces that had once been held together by the magnetic force of Ashoka's moral authority began to drift away like ships whose anchor chains had been severed. Local governors, no longer inspired by the vision of a righteous empire, started to act more like independent kings than loyal administrators. The great highways that had connected distant corners of the empire to the capital began to fall into disrepair, their maintenance neglected by officials who no longer believed in the dream of a unified India. In the frontier regions, where Ashoka's message of Dharma had once spread like wildfire among diverse populations, the flame of unity flickered and dimmed. The Bactrian Greeks, who had once respected the moral authority of the Mauryan emperor, began to see opportunity in the growing weakness of his successors. From the northwest, reports arrived of border skirmishes and territorial encroachments that would have been unthinkable during Ashoka's time. The great administrative machine that Chandragupta had built and Ashoka had perfected began to show signs of age and neglect. The network of spies and informants that had once ensured efficient governance across vast distances became a tool of paranoia and corruption. The royal treasury, once filled by the prosperous trade that flowed along secure roads, began to empty as commerce declined and tax collection became increasingly difficult. Perhaps most tragically, the very ideals that Ashoka had championed began to be seen as the source of the empire's problems. In the royal court, advisors whispered that the Buddhist emphasis on nonviolence had made the empire too soft to survive in a harsh world. Some suggested that the emperor's policy of religious tolerance had weakened the traditional Hindu foundations of Indian society. Others argued that the vast resources spent on public works and moral education would have been better invested in military strength. Brihadratha found himself caught between these competing voices, lacking the spiritual depth to navigate the complex relationship between virtue and power that his great ancestor had mastered. He was a man of decent character, but ordinary vision, trying to rule an empire that required extraordinary leadership to survive. The weight of comparison to Ashoka pressed down upon him like a physical force, making every decision feel inadequate before it was even made. The military, once the proud instrument of Mauryan expansion, had grown restless under decades of peaceful rule. The warrior class, accustomed to the glory and profit of conquest, found themselves marginalized in a society that valued merchants and monks over soldiers. The army that had once conquered most of the known world now spent its days in garrison duty and ceremonial parades, its edge dulled by years of inactivity. It was during one such ceremonial parade that the end came, swift and shocking as a thunderclap in a clear sky. Pushyamitra Shunga, the commander-in-chief of the Mauryan forces, had been a loyal servant of the empire for many years. He was a Brahmin of the old school, one who had watched with growing dismay as traditional Hindu practices were overshadowed by the Buddhist influence that had dominated the royal court since Ashoka's time. On that fateful day, as Brihadratha reviewed the troops from his ceremonial platform, surrounded by the pageantry that had once symbolized imperial power, Pushyamitra made a decision that would echo through history. In full view of the assembled army, he drew his sword and struck down the last Mauryan emperor, ending a dynasty that had ruled for over a century. The act was as much symbolic as it was political. In killing Brihadratha, Pushyamitra was not merely removing a weak ruler. He was making a statement about the failure of Ashoka's vision. The empire that had tried to rule through Dharma had proven unable to defend itself against the most basic of threats, treachery from within. The man who had preached nonviolence had left his descendants defenseless against violence. When it finally came as news of the assassination spread through the empire, the various provinces reacted with a mixture of shock, resignation, and in some cases, relief. The grand experiment of ruling through moral authority rather than military might have come to an end, not with a glorious battle or a noble defeat, but with a simple act of betrayal in broad daylight. The Shunga dynasty that Pushyamitra established would rule over a much smaller territory than the Mauryans had controlled. The dream of a unified India, held together by shared values and moral governance, fragmented into competing kingdoms and rival philosophies. The great roads fell into further disrepair. The stone pillars with their messages of Dharma began to weather and crumble, and the vast administrative network that had once connected distant corners of the subcontinent dissolved into memory. Yet, even as the political structure crumbled, something deeper survived. The ideas that Ashoka had championed, the belief in the power of moral governance, the vision of a society based on compassion rather than force. The conviction that rulers should serve their subjects rather than merely exploit them. These concepts took root in the soil of Indian civilization and continued to grow, even when the empire that had nurtured them was no more dot in the monasteries scattered across the land. Buddhist monks preserved not only the religious teachings that Ashoka had promoted, but also the memory of a time when an empire had tried to embody the highest human ideals. The stories of the great emperor's transformation from a warrior to a sage, from a conqueror to a protector, became part of the oral tradition that would inspire future generations of rulers and subjects alike. And in the quiet moments of reflection that come to all who hold power, future kings would sometimes wonder about the path not taken, the possibility of ruling through wisdom rather than force, through love rather than fear. The Mauryan Empire was gone, but the questions it had raised about the nature of just governance would continue to resonate through the corridors of power for centuries to come. As the sun set over Pataliputra on that day of betrayal, casting long shadows across the palace gardens where Ashoka had once walked in contemplation, the great experiment in dharmic rule came to its earthly end. But like the lotus that blooms most beautifully in muddy water, the ideals that had briefly flowered in the Mauryan Empire would continue to inspire those who believed that power could be wielded with wisdom, that strength could be found in compassion, and that the truest victory was the conquest of one's own heart. The empire of the sword had defeated the empire of the spirit, but the war between these two visions of human possibility was far from over. In the stories told by grandmothers to their grandchildren, in the teachings preserved in palm leaf manuscripts, in the very stones that still stood along the ancient highways, the memory of Ashoka's vision lived on, waiting for another time, another place, another ruler who might have the courage to try again. In the gentle light of dawn, as the first rays of sunlight pierce through the morning mist over the Indian subcontinent, something remarkable catches the eye of every citizen who glances at their currency, their government buildings, or their national symbols. There, carved in eternal stone and cast in bronze, stand 4 lions looking in all directions, their mouths open as if roaring a message of Dharma to the 4 corners of the world. This is the legacy of Ashoka, preserved not merely in history books, but woven into the very fabric of modern India's identity. The lion capital of Ashoka, originally erected at Sarnath, where the Buddha first preached, now serves as India's national emblem, featuring 4 lions standing back to back on a circular base, symbolizing power, courage, confidence, and pride. When India gained independence in 1947, the founding fathers chose this ancient symbol not by accident, but as a deliberate reminder of what leadership could be when guided by wisdom rather than mere ambition. The story of how this symbol came to represent a modern nation is itself a testament to the enduring power of Ashoka's vision. In the early 20th century, British archaeologist Sir Alexander Cunningham and his team unearthed the magnificent stone capital from the earth near Varanasi, where it had wool buried for over 2 millennia. As they carefully cleaned away the soil and debris, they revealed not just a masterpiece of ancient craftsmanship, but a message from the past that would speak directly to the future. When the architects of modern India gathered to design their new nation symbols, they could have chosen from countless options: the sword of conquest, the wheel of industry, the plow of agriculture. Instead, they chose the lions of Ashoka, understanding intuitively that their country needed to remember not just its power, but its capacity for transformation. The lion capital was meant to remind the Indian citizen of the nation's ancient and illustrious history, connecting modern Indians to their great ancestor Ashoka. But Ashoka's influence extends far beyond the borders of his ancient empire or the boundaries of modern India. Across the vast expanse of Asia, its legacy lives on in ways both subtle and profound. Through the missions he sent to surrounding territories, Buddhism spread not only through India, but internationally to Ceylon, Burma, Nepal, Tibet, Central Asia, China, and Japan. In the golden temples of Thailand, the mountain monasteries of Tibet, the Zen gardens of Japan, and the meditation halls of Sri Lanka, the teachings that Ashoka helped spread continue to offer peace to countless souls. The emperor who began as conqueror and became a teacher has inspired leaders across cultures and centuries. Mahatma Gandhi, India's great apostle of nonviolence, often spoke of Ashoka as proof that power and compassion could coexist. In Gandhi's own transformation, from lawyer to leader, we see echoes of the ancient emperor's journey from warrior to sage. The civil rights movement in America, the peaceful resistance movements in Eastern Europe, the truth and reconciliation processes in South Africa were all from the same well of wisdom that Ashoka discovered in his moment of awakening after Kalinga. Even in the corridors of power in the 21st century, Ashoka's name is invoked whenever leaders speak of ethical governance, of the responsibility that comes with authority, of the possibility of ruling through moral example rather than brute force. His edicts, carved in stone over 2,000 years ago, continue to offer guidance to modern policymakers, grappling with questions of justice, tolerance, and the common good. In the quiet moments of reflection that come to all who hold responsibility. For others, modern leaders sometimes find themselves facing the same choice that confronted Ashoka on the battlefield of Kalinga. They can choose the path of force, seeking to impose their will through power and intimidation. Or they can choose the more difficult path of transformation, seeking to lead by example and inspire through vision. The fact that Ashoka's name is still remembered, while the names of countless conquerors have faded into obscurity, suggests which path leads to true immortality. The emperor's influence can be seen in the very structure of modern international relations. The concept of soft power, the ability to influence others through attraction rather than coercion, has its roots in Ashoka's revolutionary understanding that lasting influence comes not from forcing others to submit, but from inspiring them to transform themselves. The United Nations, with its emphasis on dialogue over conflict, reflects principles that Ashoka would have recognized immediately. In the field of education, Ashoka's vision of learning as a tool for moral development rather than mere skill. Acquisition continues to inspire progressive educators around the world. His belief that true education should shape character as well as intellect, that knowledge should serve the cause of human flourishing rather than personal advancement, resonates with teachers who see their role as forming not just minds, but hearts. The environmental movement, too, can trace some of its inspiration to Ashoka's edicts protecting animals and forests. His understanding that human beings are part of a larger web of life, that our actions toward other species reflect our own. Spiritual development, anticipated by millennial, the ecological consciousness that is emerging in our own time. But perhaps most importantly, Ashoka's legacy lives on in the countless individuals who, faced with moments of moral choice, choose compassion over cruelty, understanding over judgment, transformation over revenge. In the teacher who chooses patience over anger when faced with a difficult student, in the parent who breaks the cycle of violence in their family, in the citizen who votes for justice rather than personal advantage, the spirit of Ashoka continues to work its quiet revolution. The emperor who once ruled over much of the known world now rules over something far greater, the imagination of humanity itself. His stone pillars may crumble, his palace may lie in ruins, his empire may be dust, but the idea he represents that power can be transformed into service, that strength can be found in gentleness, that the greatest victory is the conquest of one's own heart. This idea has achieved a kind of immortality that no earthly empire could match. In the meditation halls of Buddhist monasteries, where monks still chant the ancient prayers that Ashoka helped spread, there is a saying, "The gift of Dharma exceeds all other gifts." The emperor who learned this truth through his own suffering, became a gift to the world, a reminder that transformation is always possible, that redemption is always within reach, that the darkest night of the soul can give birth to the brightest dawn of understanding. As we close this story of an emperor who became a teacher, of a conqueror who became a protector, of a man who found the courage to change not just his own life, but the course of history itself, we are left with a question that each generation must answer anew. What legacy will we leave for those who come after us? Will we be remembered for what we conquered, or for what we transformed? Will our names be carved in stone, or will they be written in the hearts of those whose lives we touched with compassion? The lions of Ashoka still roar their ancient message across the centuries, calling us to remember that true power lies not in the ability to force others to kneel, but in the willingness to help them stand. In a world that often seems dominated by the logic of conflict and competition, the emperor who chose peace reminds us that there is another way, another possibility, another path. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the world is hushed and the heart is open, we can still hear the whispers of Ashoka, carried on the wind from the ancient stones where his message of Dharma was first carved, reminding us that the greatest revolution is the revolution of the heart. The most lasting victory is the victory over our own limitations. And the most powerful force in the universe is the force of love, transformed into action, wisdom, and compassion. The emperor is gone, but his message remains, as fresh and vital as the morning dew, as enduring as the mountains, as infinite as the human capacity for transformation. In every choice we make, in every word we speak, in every action we take, we have the opportunity to continue the work that Ashoka began, the work of building a world where power serves wisdom, where strength serves gentleness, and where the roar of the lions echoes not the sound of conquest, but the sound of awakening, calling all beings to discover the light that shines within their own hearts.